The tale unfolds in a quiet Alabama town where life moves slow, summers feel endless, and children roam beneath the heavy shade of oak trees. From the viewpoint of a young girl named Scout Finch, we watch the world as she learns it, full of curiosity, mischief, and the early stirrings of understanding that come with growing up. She and her brother Jem spend their days exploring Maycomb's dusty streets, dreaming up stories about a reclusive neighbor, and trying to understand the strange ways adults behave. Their father, Atticus, stands as a steady figure in their lives, guiding them with patience and a quiet kind of strength. When he takes on the case of a black man wrongly accused of a terrible crime, the calm rhythm of the town shifts. Hidden tensions float to the surface, and the children begin to see that the world they thought familiar is shaped by deep unfairness and long-held fears. As the trial unfolds, Scout and Jem witness how truth can be ignored when prejudice sits at the center of people's hearts. They see their father challenge that darkness with nothing more than reason, dignity, and unwavering belief in justice. What happens in that courtroom ripples far beyond its walls, touching every member of the Finch family and pushing the children toward a more complicated understanding of what it means to be good and courageous. In the months that follow, danger creeps close. Stirred by anger and resentment left in the trial's wake, the children face a moment of real peril, one that forces into the light a figure they once only imagined from shadows. Through this encounter, Scout finally sees that people are rarely what stories make them out to be, and compassion often waits behind the doors we fear to open. By the end, Scout can look at her world with clearer eyes. She understands that growing up means learning to recognize injustice, to stand firm against cruelty, and to look at others with empathy, even when the world encourages the opposite. The heart of the story rests on that simple lesson, that understanding another person begins with the courage to stand in their place for a moment and feel what they feel. When I look back across the landscape of my life, I often find myself thinking about how stories shape the way we understand the world, and how certain books settle into us, like old neighbors who never quite leave. Growing up, I learned early that the world carries its own set of unspoken rules, whispered through family histories, town gossip, and the gentle nudges of adults who thought they knew what direction a child should grow. In my earliest memories, the past was never far away. It lingered in the thick summer air, in the red dust on the road, in the voices of people who spoke as though history were still sitting beside them at the kitchen table. That sense of living amid the echoes of another era helped me understand later why some novels cling to their historical moments so tightly, and why the story of a small southern town could feel, in many ways, like a window into my own upbringing. As a child, I did not yet have the words for the deeper currents running beneath daily life, but I felt them, much like feeling the slow pull of a river's undertow. There were divisions we accepted without question, rhythms of society that seemed as natural as sunrise. Only later did I come to understand that these were not laws of nature, but constructions of people, shaped by fears, prejudices, and long-held assumptions. When I encountered stories that laid bare the way a community can lean on tradition to justify wrongdoing, I recognized something familiar, not because my world mirrored the extremes of injustice in a novel like the one under discussion, but because I knew what it meant to grow up in a place where the past pressed against the present, and where people clung tightly to beliefs inherited rather than examined. As I matured, I began to realize how profoundly a setting influences a story, just as the place where I grew up shaped the arc of my own life. The dusty roads, the humid evenings, the familiar faces at the market, and the rituals of small-town existence all worked together to create the boundaries of my young imagination. When I later learned about the historical moment in which certain novels were born, years marked by segregation, economic struggle, and shifting cultural tides, I saw these books not as distant pieces of literature, but as reflections of real pressures that people I knew had once lived through. History was not a cold list of dates, it was a living presence, carried in the memories of grandparents and the quiet hesitations in the voices of adults who did not speak openly about some parts of their past. In contemplating how a novel introduces itself and its time period, I think of how our own lives introduce us to the conditions that shape us. We do not choose the year we are born, the customs of our hometown, or the scars our community carries from earlier decades. Yet we grow under the weight and warmth of all these things. My early years were shaped by stories of struggle and endurance, told by older relatives who had known harder times. They recounted tales of work done under a fierce sun, of neighbors who stood by one another through tragedy, and of the quieter conflicts that simmered beneath polite conversation. In their recounting, I learned that no story can be understood without knowing the soil that nourished it. Likewise, a novel rooted in a specific historical era cannot be separated from the social forces that define its characters and their choices. As I grew older and read more widely, I came to appreciate how powerful it is when a writer captures not only the personal experiences of a few characters, but the broader spirit of an era. I thought about how much courage it must take to look closely at the wrongs of one's own society, to examine them with honesty, and to hold them up for others to see. In my own life, there were moments when I learned uncomfortable truths about people I admired or about traditions I once accepted without question. These realizations shaped me, just as the revelations in a story can shape the reader's understanding of a fictional town and its people. Recognizing that connection helped me reflect on how narratives can challenge our assumptions and invite to see the world with new eyes. In remembering the atmosphere of my childhood, I think about the way history lived in the silences as much as in the stories. There were subjects people avoided, feelings they kept tucked away, and boundaries they didn't cross. This quiet tension taught me to pay attention to what lay beneath the surface. When I later encountered literature that depicted divided communities or moral conflicts entangled with old prejudices, I understood the authenticity of those portrayals. I had seen, in my own community, how people could be warm and generous in one breath and narrow in the next, how they could cling to comforting narratives while ignoring the harm those same narratives caused. Observing this helped me recognize the delicate interplay between personal innocence and societal wrongdoing, a theme that runs deep in stories set in complicated historical times. As I reflect on my life now, I understand that the introduction to any story, whether it is a novel or the story of one's own beginnings, must acknowledge the forces that shape the world around its characters. Just as a writer situates a tale within the tension and transformation of a particular era, each of us grows up within the context of our family histories, community values, and the unspoken rules that we later learn to question. Looking back, I see how those early influences taught me both the comforts and constraints of tradition. They showed me why understanding the past is essential for making sense of the present, and how stories rooted in specific moments can reveal truths that stretch far beyond their setting. In this way, the introduction to a novel's historical context mirrors the introduction to my own life. It lays out the landscape, the expectations, the quiet currents of belief that flow beneath the surface of everyday actions. It hints at the challenges ahead, the lessons waiting to be learned, and the gradual awakening that comes with experience. My life, like the opening of a meaningful story, was shaped by the place and time into which I was born, by the people whose lives carried the imprint of earlier generations, and by the slow unfolding of awareness that guided me from the unquestioning world of childhood into the more complex realm of understanding, where the past and present meet in a long conversation that still continues to this very moment without ending. From the first time I learned to notice the character of a place, I understood that a town is never just a collection of roads and houses. It carries a personality, a temperament, a quiet pulse that guides the lives of the people who move through it each day. When I think of the kind of town often described in stories of the Deep South, I picture something that echoes faintly against memories I once carried from my own upbringing. A place where mornings begin with the sound of screen doors tapping shut, where the dust rises softly under passing footsteps, and where folks greet one another with a slow nod, as though time itself has agreed to move a little more gently. In considering a town like Macomb, I find myself reflecting on how the setting of any story shapes not only the characters within it, but the expectations and assumptions they inherit simply by living there. In my own life, I came to understand early on that a town holds its history, like a scent that lingers even after the wind changes. There were neighborhoods where families had lived for generations, each porch carrying the weight of stories passed quietly from one set of hands to another. Even the trees seemed familiar with the secrets of the place, their roots reaching deeper than any memory. When walking down the main street, I often felt as though the town watched over itself, keeping track of who belonged and who did not, who spoke too loudly and who held their troubles close. This sense of belonging or the lack of it, shapes the way people walk, speak, and even dream. A place like Mockingbird would be no different. Its streets would carry the residue of old traditions, unspoken rules, and long-established rhythms that guided every aspect of daily life. As a child, I did not yet grasp how deeply a place can influence the stories that unfold within it. I simply moved through my world, assuming everything around me had always been the way it was. The slow pace of life, the familiarity of neighbors, and the predictable routines created an atmosphere that felt unchanging. Only later did I realize that what seemed permanent was actually built from decisions made long before I was born. A town like the one described would similarly rest upon generations of choices, some made with kindness, others with fear. These choices shaped the architecture of both the streets and the minds of the people who lived there. When imagining such a place, I picture a courthouse rising from the town center, its columns proudly holding up more than just the weight of the roof. It would serve as a symbol both of justice and the complicated ways justice was understood. When I think of my own experiences with public institutions as a child, I recall how buildings seemed to embody authority simply by existing. Whether it was a schoolhouse or a government office, these structures carried a certain aura, as if made from more than wood or stone. They held memories of old arguments, victories, failures, and the long tension between what was right and what was customary. A town like Mockingbird would carry such tension in every brick. Beyond the courthouse, there would be streets lined with small businesses, owned by people who knew each other's families and histories far too well. I remember how, in the town where I spent my early years, the grocer always knew when someone had been struggling, and might quietly slip an extra item into a bag. At the same time, everyone also knew who had stepped out of line, who carried regrets, and who lived under the weight of whispered judgments. That kind of closeness creates a sense of comfort and confinement all at once. A community like Macomb's would have the same mixture of warmth and scrutiny, a place where kindness and criticism sat side by side, every day without conflict yet without peace. The climate itself shapes the character of such a town. I recall summers that felt as though the sun rested just above the rooftops, pressing down with a heavy, unhurried hand. Heat slows the body and the mind, encouraging long conversations on front porches and quiet moments under spreading trees. In a place like Mockingbird, the weather would act almost as a narrative companion. The gentle murmur of cicadas in the evenings, the scent of damp earth after a storm, and the way shadows stretch long and lazy across the ground would influence the way people thought and spoke. Those conditions teach patience, though sometimes they also lull people into accepting things that need to be challenged. Religion, too, in towns like this, has a strong yet subtle presence. Growing up, I learned that Sunday mornings were not just a weekly obligation, but a binding thread that wove together families and neighbors. Churches of all kinds dotted the landscape, each with its own customs and expectations. In imagining Mockingbird, I see a similar pattern. The community would expect its members to know the hymns, share the rituals, and uphold the unwritten codes of conduct that drift from pew to pew. These moral expectations often acted as a guiding force, but also sometimes tightened the boundaries of acceptable behavior. I recognized this dynamic early in my own life, even before I fully understood how morality and tradition intertwined. Then there were the racial lines that towns like mine and towns like Mockingbird carried in their very soil. Even as a child, before I had words for such divisions, I sensed them in the way adults spoke, in the hesitations between certain conversations, in the invisible lines drawn across neighborhoods. I saw how some people were treated with warmth and familiarity, while others were kept at a distance, not through overt conflict, but through long-established habits of segregation. Only later, with growing awareness, did I understand the depth of those divisions and how they shaped the experiences of everyone involved. A place like Mockingbird would reflect this same pattern, where the town's comforting exterior covered fault lines that ran deep and painful beneath the surface. Nature itself plays a role in shaping the character of a town. I recall the fields that stretched just beyond the houses, where tall grasses brushed against my ankles as I walked. The land carried its own history, stories of harvests, storms, and families who had depended on it for generations. In a town like Mockingbird, the land would tell similar tales, marking the passage of time through its changing seasons and quiet endurance. The steady cycles of planting and growth would form the background rhythm of daily life, influencing even those who never set foot in a field. When I imagine walking through a place like Maycomb, I see not just streets and buildings, but a living tapestry woven from routine, memory, and a deep sense of belonging intertwined with a persistent undercurrent of tension. Every corner would hold a story, every household a history, every person a role shaped not only by personal choices but by the expectations of a community that watches everything. And much like my own early experiences, it would take time, experience, and a widening sense of awareness to see all the layers hidden beneath the calm surface, all the unspoken truths waiting quietly to be noticed without ending. The first time I came to understand a family and a story, not as characters on a page, but as people with their own weight, their own silences, and their own gentle flaws, it was through observing a household much like the Finch family. And as I think about what it means to meet them, to walk quietly into the warmth of their small home, and feel the presence of each member, I realize that my understanding of families, both fictional and real, has always been shaped by how they face the world together. When I was young, I watched families in my own town move through life with the same mix of tenderness and tension, and I slipped those observations into the pockets of my memory the way a child might gather pebbles from a familiar path. Looking back now, I see that meeting a family in a story is much like meeting one in life. You learn them slowly, noticing what they say, what they hide, and what they hope never to lose. Atticus, as the steady center, reminds me of the sort of adults I admired from a distance, long before I understood the quiet burdens they carried. There were men in my own childhood who moved through the world just as calmly, their voices even, their tempers measured, their steps unhurried. They did not speak to impress, nor did they flaunt their strength. Instead, they held a kind of gentle authority that came not from their loudness, but from their consistency. These were the adults who taught by example rather than lecture, who corrected with patience rather than anger. In watching them, I learned that true strength often rests in restraint, in the willingness to listen, in the ability to stand firm without hardening. When I imagine Atticus in his home, I picture a man who has accepted the truth that life rarely offers simple answers, yet refuses to abandon the belief that honesty and kindness still have a place. I think of evenings in my own home, when a father figure might sit by a lamp, reading quietly, the soft rustle of pages mixing with the hum of insects outside. There is a tenderness in such scenes, the kind that passes lessons into the air without ever announcing them. Children learn from that calm presence, even when they do not realize they are learning. They absorb the rhythm of steady breathing, the careful weighing of words, the sense that a home can be anchored by one person's quiet conviction. Scout reminds me of the sort of child who sees the world with eyes unburdened by fear, though not untouched by confusion. I knew children like her, curious, outspoken, ready to question whatever seemed odd or unfair, often baffling adults who wished she would simply accept things as they were. I recall seeing that spark in friends and sometimes in myself, a determination to understand why people acted the way they did. Children like that move through life with a mixture of innocence and sharp perception, sensing when something is wrong even if they cannot yet name it. They stumble into truths that others prefer not to discuss and ask questions that stir discomfort in grown faces. In a family like the Finches, Scout's energy would stretch into every corner of the house. I can imagine her sitting at the kitchen table with elbows planted and eyes wide, interrupting with another thought before anyone finishes speaking. Children like her bring a kind of light that cuts through the dimmest assumptions because they have not yet learned to mask what they see. And though her frankness might unsettle neighbors or challenge community expectations, it also brings clarity. The world needs such voices, young ones that are not yet tamed by silence. Jem, in contrast, carries the weight of approaching adolescence, that strange bridge between childhood's certainty and the dawning awareness that the world is not as fair as he once believed. I remember the boys around my age who stood on that same threshold, their confidence wavering as they sensed the shifting ground beneath their feet. They were old enough to understand trouble, but young enough to think it could still be fixed easily. I saw in them the early shadow of responsibility, the soft ache of disappointment when confronted with the inconsistencies of the adults they admired. Boys like Jem walk through life with one foot in play and the other in contemplation, discovering that courage sometimes means acknowledging fear rather than denying it. In a family like the Finches, Jem's presence adds a quieter tension. He watches more than he speaks, calculates more than he reveals. He observes the actions of his father with a deepening sense of awe and confusion, trying to grasp what it means to be a good man in a world that does not always reward goodness. I can picture him sitting on the front steps in the fading afternoon light, lost in thought while the sounds of the neighborhood drift around him, his mind wrestling with questions too large for his young shoulders yet impossible to ignore. Together, the three form a household that reflects both strength and vulnerability, much like the families I knew growing up. There is a balance in the way they move through their days, Atticus offering quiet guidance, Scout bursting with questions, Jem grappling with change. In my memories, I see families that operated under similar rhythms. A parent trying to hold steady amid the demands of work and community. A younger child rushing ahead with unfiltered enthusiasm. An older sibling stepping into the first shadows of adulthood, trying to understand what lies beyond the familiar edges of childhood. What strikes me most about families like the Finches is how they face the world's challenges together, even when they do not fully grasp the dangers or consequences. In my own town, I watched families confront moments that tested their unity. Some stood firm, drawing closer in hardship. Others cracked under pressure that had been building long before the crisis surfaced. The Finch family brings to mind those who held tight to one another, trusting that love and integrity could cushion even the hardest blows. And while such hope does not always shield a family from pain, it does shape the way children remember their upbringing, with gratitude, clarity, and a sense of being rooted in something solid. As I reflect on meeting the Finch family in all their dimensions, I recognize pieces of my own life woven into theirs. The calm strength of a parent who teaches without harshness, the bright curiosity of childhood that refuses to look away from truth, the quiet struggles of a young person beginning to see the world as it is, rather than as they once imagined it to be. These elements form not just a fictional family, but a reflection of how many of us grew, how we learned who we were, and how we discovered the values that would carry us forward without ending. There is something about the arrival of a new child in a small neighborhood that changes the air, as though the wind decides to shift direction just to accommodate the fresh energy. I remember summers from my own childhood when a cousin or neighbor's relative would come to stay for a few weeks, and how that single addition transformed the familiar streets into a stage for grander adventures. That memory helps me understand what it means to welcome someone like Dill into the warm, slow rhythm of a place where the days stretch long and the sunlight clings to the edges of every afternoon. His presence carries with it the promise of stories, the spark of imagination, and the excitement that comes when a child arrives, with eyes full of wonder, ready to make the ordinary world feel suddenly extraordinary. Dill appears in the lives of the children with a kind of breezy unpredictability, the way the first firefly of summer flickers into view before the rest join the chorus. Children like him, with their restless curiosity and dramatic flair, have always fascinated me. In my younger years, I remember meeting a boy who, like Dill, spoke in elaborate tales about places he had never truly seen and people he claimed to know. He spun whole worlds from thin air, leaving us spellbound even when we sensed his stories did not quite hold together. But none of us minded, because what mattered was the feeling he stirred in us, that life held far more mystery than our small surroundings suggested. Dill brings that same feeling to the Finch children, reminding them that imagination is not merely a pastime but an invitation. The beginning of a summer in childhood carries a particular magic, a sense of freedom that adults often forget. It feels as though the whole world softens its rules for a little while. Bedtimes stretch later. Grass-stained knees become a badge of honor. Even the sky seems wider. When I think about the summers of my own past, I recall how each day seemed to open like a blank page waiting to be filled with daring plans, half-formed schemes, and endless games. The presence of a new companion like Dill only heightens these possibilities. Suddenly, the familiar yard becomes an unexplored wilderness. The quiet street transforms into a corridor for secret missions, and the whisper of leaves turns into a sign that adventure might be close at hand. Children like Scout and Jem, when joined by a friend who shares their hunger for excitement, become a trio bound by shared imagination. I remember afternoons spent in the company of two close friends, each of us looking to the others to extend the boundaries of our play. We constructed entire dramas out of scraps of conversation, shadows under porches, or distant houses whose occupants we never saw. In a world where adults seemed preoccupied with their own concerns, we built meaning from silence and mystery. I imagine the Finch children and Dill doing much the same, running barefoot across yards warmed by the sun, daring each other to approach places their parents warned them to avoid, whispering plans as though the fate of their small world depended on the outcome. There is always one child in every group who dares to push a little further, who leans into the unknown with breathless excitement. Dill fills that role effortlessly. Children with his temperament possess a kind of boldness that is not rooted in bravery so much as restlessness. He wants to understand everything he sees, not by asking, but by experiencing. I recall standing with friends in front of an old boarded-up house near my own childhood home, the three of us daring each other to peek inside through a crack in the wood. It was always the visiting cousin or the summer guest, the Dill of our group, who made the first move. The rest of us followed, not because we were equally brave, but because we were unwilling to let the adventure slip away without us. The Finch children's fascination with mysteries becomes amplified in Dill's company, and I understand that impulse well. Summers often sharpen a child's interest in the unknown. The long hours, the heat, and the lack of structured obligations create an environment where curiosity thrives. I was often drawn to questions that had no clear answers. What lived behind the overgrown hedge near the far end of the neighborhood? Why a particular window remained shuttered year-round? What secrets lay in the attic of an abandoned building? With friends beside me, these questions became the foundation for entire narratives we constructed, believing wholeheartedly in the stories we told because they filled the endless afternoons with meaning. Dill helped shape similar narratives for Scout and Jem, turning their imaginative impulses into entire sagas that carry them from one day to the next. What I find most endearing about the children's summer bond is the way it blends mischief with innocence. They explore not because they seek danger, but because they seek understanding. Childhood, especially in a place wrapped in tradition and quiet expectations, often leaves young minds yearning for something unusual, something that breaks the monotony of the everyday. Dill, with his bright ideas and dramatic gestures, becomes the spark that keeps their curiosity burning. I think of the times my friends and I created elaborate plans to venture into places we found intriguing for no reason other than that they felt forbidden. The forbidden, in a child's mind, becomes irresistible. Yet beneath the thrill lies a softer longing to see the world from a new angle and feel one step closer to growing up. What deepens the significance of those summer adventures is the way they bind the children together in a season that feels untouched by the troubles of the larger world. I remember how summer friendships in my own youth carried a kind of intensity that never quite repeated itself in later years. There was something pure about those bonds formed in the heat, something shaped by the luxury of time and the absence of responsibility. You learn each other's secrets without meaning to, spend hours talking about dreams too big to fit into the confines of a small town, and come to understand your friends in a way that feels effortless. Dill's arrival weaves him into the fabric of the Finch children's lives in just that intimate, fleeting way. As the season stretches on, the children find their identities in relation to one another. Scout's boldness, Jem's steadying maturity, Dill's whimsical daring. I recall experiencing something similar as a child, finding myself reflected in my friends' laughter, arguments, and shared hopes. Each of us played a role, and yet we grew through the presence of the others. The friendships of summer have a way of teaching lessons long before we realize we have learned them, about loyalty, courage, forgiveness, and the bittersweet nature of time. Thinking back on those days from the vantage point of adulthood, I understand why the memory of such seasons lingers for a lifetime. They mark a period when the world feels wide open yet safely contained, when imagination reigns without apology, and when the arrival of a single new friend can reshape the entire landscape of one's young heart. Dill brings that transformation into Scout and Jem's world, turning ordinary days into unforgettable adventures, encouraging them to see more, feel more, and question more. And just like the summer friends of my own past, his presence leaves an imprint that extends far beyond the season itself, shaping the children's understanding of themselves and the world around them without ending. There are figures in every childhood whose presence never quite settles into clarity, people who linger in the corners of memory like half-finished sketches. When I think back to my own youth, There was always at least one house that seemed too quiet, too shadowed, too full of stories whispered behind cupped hands. It might have belonged to an elderly man no one saw except at dusk, or a family that kept to themselves so thoroughly that their windows seemed to blink rather than shine. Those mysteries drew us in, not out of malice, but from the simple hunger children have to make sense of what feels unknown. That same impulse shapes the way the children regard someone like Boo Radley, who stands as a living question mark in their world. Even before they understood his story, the aura surrounding him seemed to thicken the air on certain streets and deepen the hush of late afternoon, creating a strange blend of fear and fascination that only childhood can conjure. When a figure becomes the focus of a community's quiet speculation, they begin to take on a shape that has less to do with truth and more to do with imagination. In my own early years, I remember hearing tales about a man who lived down the road, stories spun from rumors and stitched with the threads of exaggeration. He was said to come out only at night, or to speak to no one except the stray cats that trailed him. We built whole legends around this man, though we barely understood his circumstances. In hindsight, I know now that loneliness and sorrow often create such retreats from the world. But at the time, the mystery seemed captivating. Boo Radley becomes a similar symbol for the Finch children, not because he seeks their attention, but because the silence around him invites the young mind to fill in the blanks with wild invention. Children carry a remarkable capacity for imagination, especially when faced with something they cannot comprehend. Boo Radley's secluded life becomes fertile ground for the children's creativity. They build stories about him the way I once built stories about houses with boarded windows or yards overrun with vines. When you cannot see the truth, you create one that feels true enough for your purposes. It is both a coping mechanism and a kind of play. In the long stretch of summer, when the hours move slowly and curiosity grows restless, such characters become the anchors of endless games and whispered challenges. Boo's house becomes the center of their adventures, a physical point through which their fears and hopes continually circle. Yet beneath the children's theatrical fears lies something deeper, something closer to empathy, though they do not yet recognize it. I recall moments from my own childhood when I felt drawn toward a person or place that frightened me. The fear was real, yet it was mixed with a yearning to understand, to glimpse what life looked like beyond my own narrow circle. That complexity pulses through the children's fascination with Boo Radley. They want to know him, even if they cannot articulate why. And beneath their wild stories lies the truth that children often sense loneliness in others even before they understand its weight. The uncertainty surrounding Boo becomes a reflection of the community's unspoken rules. Every town has its own silent boundaries, places where people do not tread, names spoken in lowered tones, stories told with a shrug meant to hide discomfort. In the town of my youth, I learned early that adults sometimes participated in such quiet ostracism not because they understood the full situation, but because it had always been that way. Boo Radley occupies that same kind of liminal space, neither fully villain nor fully victim in the eyes of the children, but a figure molded by the town's long-standing unease. The Finch children inherit that unease, but being young, they also challenge it in their own innocent ways. As they inch closer to the Radley place in their games, I am reminded of the boundaries my friends and I pushed against when we were young. There was an abandoned yard behind a sagging fence where we used to dare each other to step inside. We swore we saw movement from the corners of our eyes, though we later realized it was only the shifting of light through the leaves. Still, the thrill of that moment stays with me. It was not the yard itself that captivated us, but the feeling of approaching something forbidden, of testing our courage against the unknown. Scout, Jem, and Dill experience a similar excitement as they circle Boo's world, though they do not yet understand the humanity at the heart of the mystery. What deepens the complexity of Boo's character is the way he remains unseen yet felt. Some people, even in silence, cast a long presence. I can recall teachers, relatives, or neighbors whose quietness made them appear distant, yet their actions revealed a warmth or attentiveness that contradicted the stories told about them. In childhood, such contradictions often go unnoticed until some small gesture breaks through the veil of myth. A gift left unexpectedly, a kind word passed through an intermediary, a simple act that suggests someone has been watching over you more closely than you realized. Boo Radley's quiet gestures toward the children echo those subtle kindnesses I only learned to recognize much later in life. These gestures hint at a heart shielded by circumstance but still capable of gentleness. The children's evolving perception of Boo mirrors the journey many of us take as we grow, moving from fear to curiosity, then from curiosity to understanding. I remember how the figures who once frightened me eventually became people whose struggles I came to comprehend. Age brings clarity, a softening of the imagination's harsher edges. Yet there is something profoundly moving about the first time a child realizes that the person they feared is in fact vulnerable. Boo Radley becomes a vessel for that realization. His quiet presence teaches the children, long before they can articulate it, that the world is rarely divided into simple categories of good and bad, safe and dangerous. The deepest mystery of Boo Radley is not in the stories the children create about him, but in the way he becomes an unwitting mirror for their own growth. Their understanding of him shifts as they themselves shift, moving from playfulness to awareness. In this way, he becomes not just a figure of curiosity, but a symbol of the unknown aspects of every human being. I have come to understand, through the course of my own life, that people hold far more beneath the surface than what they show. Sometimes they hide their pain behind silence. Sometimes they shield their kindness behind a reputation built by others. And sometimes, without meaning to, they become a canvas onto which children project their fears, their questions, and their longing for adventure. Reflecting on the enigma of Boo Radley now, I see more than just a mysterious neighbor. I see the universal figure of the misunderstood, the quiet person judged without reason, the lonely soul whom children notice before adults ever stop to think. I see how childhood often teaches us to fear what we do not know, and how growing up teaches us to look again with gentler eyes. And I see how every community, no matter how small or familiar, holds at least one story like his. A story waiting patiently at the edge of the light, hoping one day to be seen for what it truly is without ending. Starting school marks a turning point in any child's life. A moment when the small, familiar circle of home widens into a world filled with new faces, expectations, and the subtle pressures of society that a young mind is only beginning to sense. When I think of Scout stepping into that schoolyard for the first time, I cannot help but recall my own early days of schooling, when I walked into a room crowded with voices and felt the weight of unfamiliar rules press against my shoulders. The world expands in a way that feels both thrilling and unsettling. For Scout, as for many children, school becomes not just a place to learn arithmetic or spelling, but a space where she begins to encounter the complicated truths adults are often reluctant to confess. The first moments of school are filled with the innocent hope that all children carry. Scout approaches learning with eagerness, comforted by the thought that reading and understanding come naturally to her. I felt something similar as a child, believing school would simply be an extension of home, where curiosity was welcomed and where adults encouraged questions rather than pushed them aside. But the reality is often different. Scout discovers quickly that her readiness to learn does not fit neatly into the expectations of a rigid system. I recall teachers who valued uniformity over individual spark, who insisted children move at the same pace and discouraged any sign of learning that did not arrive at the appointed time. For Scout, this becomes the first crack in the bright image she had painted of school. In these early lessons, Scout begins to sense the contradictions adults live with, the unspoken hypocrisies that shape the classroom and the wider community. I learned, as she does, that school is sometimes the place where society's values show themselves most plainly. A teacher may preach fairness, yet treat a struggling child with impatience. A lesson may encourage kindness while the playground whispers its own rules of exclusion. Scout's first encounters with classmates reveal that children often mirror the beliefs handed down at home. I remember sitting beside classmates who repeated things they did not understand, words heavy with bias that they had heard from older siblings or parents. We absorbed these messages not because they made sense, but because they were constant, woven into the rhythm of daily life. For Scout, the realization that prejudice shapes the behavior of those around her is both confusing and eye-opening. she hears children speak about families in ways that reveal long-standing divides she had never fully recognized. I, too, noticed early on how certain names carried a tone when spoken, how some families were praised while others were dismissed with a sigh or a raised eyebrow. These distinctions puzzled me at first, because children naturally assume fairness until shown otherwise. When Scout witnesses classmates judged by their backgrounds rather than their character, she begins to understand that the world outside her home operates on assumptions she has not yet learned to accept. One of the earliest lessons Scout confronts is that poverty, though often unspoken, casts a long shadow over the classroom. Children arrive with different levels of privilege, some with packed lunches and clean clothes, others with empty pockets, and the grim resignation of knowing they will be misunderstood. In my own school years, I remember classmates who carried the weight of their family's struggles in the way they held their shoulders or avoided eye contact. Scout notices these differences too, though she cannot yet grasp the full depth of them. Her confusion about why certain children are treated with pity and others with disdain reveals how deeply social divisions are rooted even among the young. The tensions between families also begin to shape Scout's view of her peers. In every community, certain households carry reputations passed down through generations. I recall how some families were whispered about in the same breath as past misdeeds, as though their present lives were destined to repeat what came before. Scout witnesses this same inherited judgment, realizing that children are labeled long before they have a chance to define themselves. This early exposure to generational prejudice teaches her that society often judges without understanding, condemns without questioning, and holds onto assumptions long after they cease to be true. One of the most striking aspects of Scout's early school experience is the disconnect between what she learns at home and what she encounters among her classmates. At home, she has been taught to respect dignity, question unfairness, and treat people with empathy. At school, she is confronted with the opposite: children mocking those who have less, dismissing those who live differently, and repeating prejudiced beliefs they barely comprehend. I remember feeling a similar dissonance, recognizing that the lessons I learned at home did not always align with the unspoken rules among my peers. It is a bewildering moment when a child realizes that doing what feels right may set them apart rather than bring them closer to others. Scout's discomfort in school grows not only from the judgments of her classmates, but from the way adults reinforce the very prejudices they claim to oppose. Teachers may speak of fairness and equality, yet their actions betray favoritism or bias. In my early schooling, I saw similar contradictions. Teachers who spoke of treating everyone the same yet responded differently depending on a child's background or behavior. These mixed messages taught me, as they teach Scout, that adults often struggle to uphold the values they profess. It is a difficult truth for a child to swallow, because children instinctively look to adults for consistency and clarity. As Scout navigates these early challenges, she begins to learn something essential about prejudice. It is often subtle, disguised as tradition or politeness or simple expectation. It hides in the way people speak to one another, the way they categorize others, the way they decide who deserves attention or kindness. In my own life, I recognize that prejudice rarely announces itself boldly. Instead, it slips into conversation through faint dismissals or quiet assumptions. Scout, though young, begins to sense these undercurrents, even if she cannot yet articulate them. These early experiences teach Scout that not all learning happens from books or lessons written on a chalkboard. Some lessons come from observing the way people treat one another, from noticing the tone adults use when discussing certain families, from feeling the sting of unfairness not directed at oneself but at someone nearby. I recall similar moments in my childhood, watching a classmate belittled, seeing someone punished more harshly because of who they were, and feeling the first stirrings of righteous anger. These experiences shape a child more deeply than any formal lesson because they reveal the truth of the world beyond the surface. Scout's early school days become a foundation for understanding the larger injustices she will encounter later. Childhood offers the first glimpses of the divisions adults try to conceal. It exposes the quiet cruelty that can appear in innocent conversations, the inherited beliefs that rest unchallenged in daily life, and the way individuals become separated not by ability or character, but by assumptions made long before they speak. Scout begins to learn that prejudice is not merely an abstract idea, but a force that shapes interactions, opportunities, and the tender hearts of children, learning to find their place in a complicated world. In reflecting on Scout's first school experiences, I see echoes of my own early discoveries, moments when innocence gave way to awareness, when fairness met reality, and when the truths whispered by the world were louder than the lessons offered in the classroom. It is in these small, disquieting moments that a child begins to understand what justice truly means and why it matters. Long before she has the words to name what she feels without ending, Atticus's role in the lives of his children reminds me of the kind of steady presence some of us were fortunate enough to grow up with, the kind of guidance that does not rely on loud instruction, but on quiet example. When I think about the moral teachings that shape a family, I think first of gentle conversations at the end of long days, of lessons delivered not with stern authority, but with patient clarity. Atticus's influence settles into Scout and Jem's lives in that calm, persistent way that good teachings often do. He does not push his beliefs onto them. Instead, he lives them, allowing the children to absorb values almost the way one absorbs sunlight, gradually, naturally, without realizing how much warmth is being gathered until it is needed later. In my own early years, I encountered adults who carried themselves with the same balanced mixture of firmness and compassion. They spoke softly, but their words carried weight because they rose from a place of conviction rather than control. These adults taught right from wrong through the consistency of their actions. I recall one such figure who never raised a hand or voice, yet I always knew which path he hoped I would take simply by watching how he lived his own life. Atticus holds that same quiet strength, guiding Scout and Jem through example rather than force. His lessons unfold in simple moments: how he treats neighbors, how he carries himself in difficult circumstances, how he chooses fairness even when the world encourages the easier path of silence. One of the most striking aspects of his teachings is the emphasis on seeing others as full human beings. When I was young, I did not fully understand the power of perspective, but I remember being encouraged to listen to others before forming judgments. Atticus teaches Scout and Jem that understanding comes from stepping outside one's own immediate feelings and imagining the world through someone else's eyes. This idea feels especially profound because children are often guided by instinct rather than consideration. It takes patience to teach them that empathy is not weakness, but strength. I recall moments when an adult in my life gently redirected my anger or confusion simply by reminding me that another person might be hurting too. Atticus offers that same compassion to his children, showing them that kindness begins with allowing others their dignity. Atticus also teaches courage in a way that differs from childhood fantasies of bravery. To a child, courage often looks like daring acts, bold leaps, or confrontations that leave the heart pounding. But the courage Atticus shows, and hopes his children will one day understand, lives in quieter places. It exists in doing what is right, even when no one stands behind you, in speaking truth, even when your voice is the only one that rises in the room. I learned this lesson myself, not from heroic events, but from watching someone stand firm in the face of criticism, refusing to abandon principle even when it costs them comfort. That kind of courage leaves a deep impression on a child, shaping the way they come to understand what bravery truly is. Another element of Atticus's teaching that resonates deeply is his insistence on fairness. Children have a natural sense of justice, though it often centers on their own experiences. Atticus helps expand Scout and Jem's understanding, showing them that fairness is not about receiving equal treatment, but about recognizing and correcting imbalance. In my own family, conversations around fairness often surfaced at the dinner table, where stories of the day were shared openly. I witnessed adults acknowledge when someone had been wronged and refused to let unfairness pass without comment. That willingness to advocate for what is right, no matter how small the situation seemed, taught me that fairness is not merely a value, but a responsibility. Atticus's values also extend to humility, a trait that often goes unrecognized but deeply influences the character of a home. He does not boast of his intelligence or moral clarity. Instead, he lives modestly, never placing himself above others. I saw similar humility in certain adults from my childhood, those who never demanded praise yet earned respect simply by being consistent in their goodness. Scout and Jem learned through him that strength does not require hardness, and that confidence does not require arrogance. They absorb the idea that one can be knowledgeable without belittling others and principled without preaching. Even in discipline, Atticus shows a gentle wisdom that sets the tone for the household. He does not punish impulsively or let emotion dictate his responses. Instead, he guides Scout and Jem toward understanding why their actions matter. I remember being corrected in a similar way, not shamed but asked to reflect. The adults who influenced me most did not try to control me through fear. They trusted that I could grow into understanding, and that trust, more than anything, made me want to live up to the standard they believed I could meet. Atticus offers Scout and Jem the same trust, teaching them that responsibility grows from being treated with respect. Perhaps the most defining aspect of Atticus's moral teachings is the way he navigates the tension between the ideals he holds and the flawed world he lives in. He does not pretend society is fair, or that doing what is right will always lead to a just outcome. Yet he refuses to retreat into cynicism. I learned over time that this balance is one of the hardest to maintain. It is easy to grow disillusioned and equally easy to turn away from difficult truths. The adults who shaped my sense of morality face those truths directly, acknowledging injustice without allowing it to erode their integrity. Atticus embodies that same resolve, teaching his children that moral clarity must persist even in the face of disappointment. Family values in the Finch household are not built on grand gestures but on daily choices. They are woven into the conversations shared at the kitchen table, the quiet reading hours in the evening, the way Atticus listens to his children with full attention. I recall evenings in my own home where the simple act of gathering together made everything feel anchored. Those moments taught me that family values are not about perfection, but about presence, being willing to hear one another, to comfort one another, to grow together through both joy and hardship. Scout and Jem learn that family is a place of honesty and acceptance, a place where questions are welcomed rather than dismissed. In all of these ways, Atticus's teachings extend far beyond moral instruction. They shape the very foundation of Scout and Jem's understanding of the world. They learn that compassion is not a weakness, that fairness matters even when it is difficult, that courage often requires standing alone, and that humility can carry more power than pride. These lessons settle into them gradually, preparing them for the challenges that await beyond childhood. And as I reflect on the influences that shaped me, I see clearly how such teachings endure, guiding a person long after childhood has passed, becoming the quiet voice inside that whispers the right thing to do even when the world seems determined to ignore it without ending. The day the mad dog appeared on the street was the sort of event that settles into memory because it disrupts the ordinary flow of life, a sudden intrusion that carries more than immediate danger. It carries a lesson, a symbol, and a mirror for the truths of a community. I remember moments from my own childhood when an event, seemingly small to outsiders, reshaped the way people understood courage, responsibility, and fear. That dog, stricken and wild, moving down the narrow street, becomes far more than a threat to the town's safety. It becomes a lens through which the children, and the town itself, begin to see the complicated interplay of human behavior, morality, and latent tension. I recall walking through neighborhoods as a child where certain disruptions, an argument, an accident, an unexpected visitor, created a pause in the ordinary rhythm of life. Adults moved differently, children watched more closely, and the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. In that same way, the mad dog entering the street shifts Maycomb from a lazy afternoon to a moment of heightened awareness. It is not just the animal itself that commands attention, but the fear it evokes, the sense that even the familiar can become dangerous when unchecked. Childhood is punctuated with such awakenings, where the ordinary turns suddenly into a lesson in perception and consequence. The dog's illness is a kind of hidden danger, invisible until it bursts into view. I remember the concept of invisible threats as a child, the idea that danger often lurks where we least expect it, masked by normalcy. In the Finch neighborhood, the dog's sudden appearance forces both the children and adults to confront the fragility of safety. It is a tangible moment that embodies the larger, less visible threats of life, such as prejudice, injustice, and the unspoken divisions that govern social conduct. The way a community responds to a real immediate danger reveals truths about character, just as it reveals the capacity for fear and the need for courage. Atticus's role in confronting the dog mirrors the quiet, steady moral authority he exhibits in all aspects of life. I remember adults in my own childhood whose calm decisiveness in moments of crisis left a lasting impression, not because they boasted of bravery, but because they faced danger with a careful, measured mind. The act of taking responsibility when others hesitate is a form of courage that leaves an indelible mark on observers. For Scout and Jem, seeing their father step forward, armed and unflinching, teaches a lesson about the nature of bravery, how it often requires doing what must be done even when fear is present, and without fanfare or recognition. The children's fear and fascination with the dog illustrate the tension between instinct and understanding. I recall how, as a child, I observed threats with a mixture of terror and curiosity, unable to fully separate the danger from the intrigue it created. The mad dog embodies that duality perfectly. Scout and Jem watch as the animal moves erratically, its every step uncertain yet menacing. They sense the threat on a visceral level, but they also recognize, through the actions of Atticus and the sheriff, that fear can be controlled, channeled, and faced with composure. Childhood teaches that such moments are formative, that the lessons learned in the face of fear often endure longer than those learned in safety. The mad dog also serves as a metaphor for the dangers that simmer in Maycomb long before they become obvious. I remember learning, in small ways, that communities harbor their own forms of aggression and unpredictability, often masked by polite behavior and the routines of daily life. The dog's illness is like the latent prejudices and grudges that exist quietly in a town, unnoticed until circumstances bring them to the surface. Its presence on the street forces the community to act collectively, highlighting both the courage and the reluctance that lie within its members. For Scout and Jem, this is a subtle lesson in observing human behavior, understanding that fear and morality often coexist uneasily. The way the town reacts to the threat reflects deeper truths about the social fabric. Some move quickly to protect themselves, some freeze in hesitation, and others, like Atticus, take the necessary action that requires skill, focus, and courage. I remember seeing similar patterns in my own youth, where moments of stress revealed hidden strengths or weaknesses among neighbors and adults alike. These moments teach children about responsibility, not abstract responsibility, but the tangible kind that demands action, careful thought, and sometimes personal risk. The mad dog is not simply a test of physical courage, but a lesson in moral and emotional awareness, a symbol of the way a community contends with danger when it cannot be ignored. The children's understanding of Atticus deepens in this incident as they begin to reconcile the calm, scholarly figure they know at home with the man who takes decisive action in a moment of crisis. I recall experiencing a similar revelation with adults in my own life, moments when someone I had always respected showed me a side I had never witnessed, a capability, a steadiness, a bravery that had been quiet but ever present. Such revelations are formative, allowing children to see the complexity of the people they admire. Scout and Jem begin to recognize that true strength is not loud or performative. It is deliberate, thoughtful, and grounded in principle. The incident also introduces the concept that courage often requires mastery and preparation, not just impulse. Atticus does not aim hastily, he assesses the situation, understands the stakes, and acts with precision. I remember learning as a child that some of the bravest acts are those carried out with knowledge and calm, rather than recklessness. This is a lesson that extends beyond the immediate danger of the mad dog to the broader challenges of life, the courage to stand against injustice, the patience to wait for the right moment, and the clarity to act when necessary. Finally, the mad dog episode becomes a mirror for the latent dangers in the world beyond Maycomb. I remember how, in my own experience, childhood events often carry symbolic weight far beyond their immediate context. A fallen tree, a sudden storm, a misbehaving animal, all could be seen as metaphors for challenges to come. In the same way, the mad dog symbolizes the unpredictable, sometimes violent forces that Scout and Jem will encounter in life. It is a vivid reminder that the world is not always safe, that danger can appear suddenly, and that courage, morality, and calm observation are indispensable tools for navigating it. Through this incident, the children internalize lessons about fear, responsibility, and the subtle forms of courage that adults practice daily. I have always understood that the most enduring childhood lessons are those that blend experience with observation, imagination with reality. The mad dog does not merely pose a physical threat, it becomes a turning point, a symbol that resonates long after the danger has passed, shaping the way Scout and Jem perceive their father, their community, and the moral choices that will come to define them without ending. There are some figures in childhood whose presence is unsettling not because of overt menace but because they hold a mirror to the discomforts and contradictions of life. People who challenge our assumptions and force us to reckon with qualities we do not yet understand. Mrs. Dubose is one such figure, a woman whose sharp tongue and stubborn ways make her a source of fear, confusion, and eventual insight for the Finch children. I remember the adults in my own youth who inspired similar feelings, those who seemed impossible to approach without trepidation, yet who carried truths that could not be ignored. Their lessons often arrived wrapped in difficulty, delivered in ways that demanded attention not just to words but to underlying character. Mrs. Dubose embodies such lessons, offering a glimpse into the complexity of human courage, the kind that does not announce itself but demands quiet recognition. From the beginning, she is an enigma to Scout and Jem, a figure both intimidating and fascinating. I recall children encountering similar personalities, neighbors or relatives whose temperaments were rigid and unyielding, yet whose lives revealed layers of resilience and principle beneath the surface. Mrs. Dubose's harshness is immediate and tangible, striking the children with the bluntness of her remarks, the cutting quality of her voice, and the weight of her disapproval. But it is precisely this unfiltered presence that sets the stage for a deeper lesson, one that cannot be taught in school or explained in conversation, but must be understood through observation, empathy, and reflection. Children, in my experience, often resist such figures at first, yet later find that they have absorbed more than they realized through the process of confrontation and engagement. Atticus, in his quiet way, frames Mrs. Dubose not merely as a troublesome neighbor, but as a teacher in the subtle art of courage. I remember adults in my own childhood who spoke of bravery not as something displayed publicly or loudly, but as the discipline to confront one's own weaknesses. This idea was foreign to children, who naturally equate courage with action that can be seen and admired. Mrs. Dubose's struggle is internal, invisible to most, yet Atticus guides Jem and Scout to recognize the magnitude of it. The children initially perceive her merely as mean and cantankerous, but through their father's guidance, they begin to understand that real courage often resides in the quiet, grueling fight against one's own limitations and fears. The first step toward understanding this comes when Jem is assigned to read to her as a kind of penance, a task meant to atone for the insults he and Scout suffered under her tongue. I remember similar experiences in my own childhood, where responsibility was meted out in ways that seemed arbitrary or burdensome, but later revealed a deeper purpose. Sitting with Mrs. Dubose, day after day, reading aloud as she grips her pride and struggles with pain, the children witness courage in a form that is neither glamorous nor immediately comprehensible. They see a person fighting a battle that has no spectators, whose victory is not celebrated in applause but exists only in the act itself. In observing Mrs. Dubose, Scout and Jem begin to understand that courage involves endurance. I recall moments in my youth when adults confronted their own hardships silently, refusing to surrender to despair even when it seemed easier to do so. Mrs. Dubose's determination to free herself from the grip of morphine before she dies is a visible manifestation of this principle. It is not simply her confrontation with addiction that impresses the children, but her willingness to face immense pain for the sake of her dignity and autonomy. The lesson here is subtle. Courage is as much about internal resolve as it is about outward action, and sometimes the most heroic battles are fought in private, away from notice or acclaim. There is also a lesson in humility and perspective. The children must come to see that people who appear harsh or disagreeable on the surface may be engaged in struggles far beyond the understanding of a child. I remember learning similar truths through encounters with difficult adults, where first impressions, frustration, anger, rigidity, gradually gave way to comprehension and even respect. Mrs. Dubose teaches that human worth cannot be measured simply by pleasantness or charm, but by the strength with which one faces unavoidable suffering. Scout and Jem, by following their father's guidance, begin to recognize that each individual's life carries hidden complexities and that empathy requires patient observation as well as imagination. The symbolic resonance of Mrs. Dubose's struggle is profound. She is, in many ways, a figure who represents the broader fight against injustice, weakness, and fear in society, and the courage she demonstrates parallels the moral battles that Atticus himself undertakes. I recall thinking as a child about the quiet victories people achieved against odds that seemed insurmountable, whether in resisting temptation, confronting personal prejudice, or persisting in acts of integrity. Mrs. Dubose's battle is smaller in scale but echoes the same principles: a steadfast refusal to yield to forces that would compromise her principles, a willingness to endure suffering for the sake of self-respect, and an understanding that true courage is measured not by recognition, but by the fidelity of one's own convictions. Through the lens of her struggle, the children begin to differentiate between superficial bravery and enduring courage. I remember learning as a child that it was easy to admire those who acted boldly in the open, yet far more challenging to appreciate those who persisted quietly in the face of relentless internal struggle. Mrs. Dubose embodies the latter, demonstrating that courage is less about the applause it attracts and more about the personal integrity it requires. For Scout and Jem, this lesson extends beyond their interactions with her. It becomes a framework through which they can interpret other acts of bravery in their community, including their father's defense of Tom Robinson, and even the unseen courage of neighbors and acquaintances whose battles remain private. The process of understanding Mrs. Dubose also teaches patience and reflection. Children naturally seek immediate explanations, and their initial judgments are often harsh. Yet sitting with her over hours and days, witnessing both her pain and her steadfastness, Scout and Jem gradually internalize the notion that true moral insight emerges slowly and through sustained engagement. I remember learning the same lesson when observing difficult people or situations in my own life. Initial impressions rarely capture the full truth. An understanding requires time, empathy, and attention to the unseen struggles that shape human behavior. Finally, the encounter with Mrs. Dubose instills in the children a profound respect for the complexities of human character. Courage is not always heroic in the conventional sense, and virtue is often hidden beneath layers of difficulty, pride, and suffering. I recall thinking as a child about the people I admired most, not for their wealth, social status, or ease, but for their quiet resilience in the face of hardship. Mrs. Dubose embodies that resilience, and through her, Scout and Jem learn that the moral fabric of a person is measured not by comfort or recognition, but by the ability to confront fear, endure pain, and act in accordance with principle. In reflecting on Mrs. Dubose and her influence on the Finch children, I see the enduring truth that lessons in courage and morality are rarely straightforward. They arrive in unexpected forms, often from people whose surface demeanor is difficult or unpleasant, and they require careful observation and open-mindedness to fully grasp. Scout and Jem's understanding of her struggle becomes a foundation for their emerging moral consciousness, preparing them to recognize bravery, integrity, and resilience in all their complex and often quiet forms, teaching them that real courage is not measured by applause or recognition, but by the ability to confront one's own fears and weaknesses without ending. The moment the town learns that Atticus will defend Tom Robinson, a man accused of a crime simply because of the color of his skin, is the moment when the quiet rhythms of Maycomb are pierced by the raw, unfiltered reality of prejudice. I recall similar moments from my own early life, when an adult took a stand that unsettled the comfortable assumptions of a community, when the very air seemed to shift and ordinary conversations became charged with tension. The reaction of the townspeople is not sudden but builds like a low hum beneath the daily routines, a current that shifts glances, stiffens conversations, and exposes the anxieties and moral fractures long hidden behind polite smiles and measured words. Children are acutely sensitive to these shifts, though they may not immediately understand them. Scout and Jem feel the weight of the town's scrutiny in subtle and overt ways, noticing whispers as they pass neighbors, sensing tension in the voices of friends' parents, and observing the quiet disdain of those who once seemed friendly or indifferent. I remember experiencing a similar awareness in my own childhood, when the world of adults seemed suddenly less predictable, more dangerous, and full of unspoken rules that governed behavior in ways I did not yet fully comprehend. The case against Tom Robinson becomes a lens through which the children perceive the fragility of justice and the insidious ways prejudice can infiltrate daily life. Atticus himself becomes a target, not because of anything he has done wrong, but because he embodies a principle that challenges the town's deeply held assumptions. I recall adults in my own life whose insistence on fairness or integrity created discomfort among peers who preferred the safety of conformity. They became subjects of gossip, sometimes admiration, often resentment, and the children observing them absorbed lessons about courage and integrity that would resonate far longer than any classroom teaching. Atticus faces the town's disapproval with quiet resolve, refusing to be swayed by intimidation or social pressure, and in doing so, he models for Scout and Jem the complexity of moral action. Standing for what is right often invites criticism, isolation, and hostility. The tension escalates in subtle social ways. Invitations are withdrawn, remarks are made with a pointed edge, and the children encounter both passive and active forms of hostility. I remember the dissonance of learning that people could appear friendly in one context and coldly judgmental in another, a lesson in the contradictions of human behavior that is often first glimpsed in childhood. The Finch family, once comfortably situated in Maycomb society, suddenly navigates a landscape fraught with invisible barriers and coded signals, where ordinary civility is overshadowed by suspicion, resentment, or thinly veiled contempt. This shift illuminates for the children that the moral world is rarely simple, that justice is not always aligned with popular sentiment, and that doing the right thing can carry real personal cost. Children's understanding of these dynamics is heightened by the way adults around them respond. Some display admiration for Atticus, quietly supporting him in small, often unnoticed ways, while others react with open disdain or passive complicity. I remember recognizing as a child that adults rarely fit neatly into categories of good or bad, and that character is revealed not only in words, but in subtle actions. Who looks away when injustice occurs, who steps forward quietly to offer assistance, and who permits wrong to continue by their silence. Scout and Jem absorb these lessons in observation, often more effectively than through any explicit teaching, as they witness the interplay of courage, prejudice, and social expectation in real time. The children are also confronted with the personal dimensions of racial prejudice. They see the fear and tension it instills in their own community, notice the whispered warnings, and feel the unease of neighbors who would rather not confront injustice. I remember sensing similar tensions in my youth, the way children perceive the unspoken rules and hidden animosities among adults, recognizing that the world is not simply fair or predictable. This awareness creates in Scout and Jem a burgeoning consciousness of the inequalities that structure society, a consciousness that is at once bewildering and formative, shaping the lens through which they view subsequent events in Maycomb. The press of opinion and the weight of community expectation make daily life in Maycomb both ordinary and extraordinary at once. Ordinary routines, walking to school, passing neighbors, attending church, become charged with significance. Every glance or remark is scrutinized for hidden meaning, and the children begin to learn that morality in a community is not abstract, but lived, constantly negotiated through interactions both small and large. I recall similar lessons in my own youth, when the behavior of adults, subtle or overt, revealed principles and biases that could not be ignored. Scout and Jem learned that standing by principle often isolates one from the crowd, yet that isolation is sometimes necessary for integrity to survive. The tension also crystallizes in acts of direct confrontation. Scout experiences taunts from classmates. Jem is challenged by peers who cannot reconcile their father's choices with the town's expectations, and the children encounter both fear and admiration from those around them. I remember feeling that same mixture of confusion and awakening as a child, recognizing that moral courage often provokes discomfort in others precisely because it disrupts their assumptions and forces them to reckon with their own values. These interactions teach the children that justice and fairness are not universally recognized, and that advocacy for what is right can provoke resistance, hostility, and misunderstanding. Atticus's conduct in the face of this growing hostility is itself a lesson in the interplay of principle and restraint. He neither exaggerates his heroism nor diminishes the reality of the challenges he faces. I recall adults in my own childhood who faced similar scrutiny, maintaining composure and dignity under pressure, demonstrating that moral authority often rests in quiet consistency rather than loud declarations. Scout and Jem observe that standing firm requires patience, self-control, and an unshakable commitment to truth. Lessons that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of Tom Robinson's trial. The racial tensions in Mockingbird also highlight the interconnectedness of justice, morality, and community perception. Children see that wrongdoing is not always punished, that fairness is not guaranteed, and that societal prejudice can cloud judgment even in the face of clear evidence. I remember coming to understand as a child that human societies are imperfect, that systemic inequities often persist despite individual virtue, and that recognizing these realities is part of growing up. Scout and Jem's observations of the town's reactions serve as a foundation for their emerging understanding of the complexities of justice and the courage required to defend it. Finally, the reaction of the town serves as a mirror for the children's own moral development. They are forced to reckon with the realities of prejudice, the courage of their father, and the ways in which fear, ignorance, and tradition shape behavior. I have always believed that children learn most deeply from lived experience, from observing human behavior in its unvarnished form. And this period in Scout and Jem's lives is precisely that kind of education. They begin to understand that standing for what is right will not always be met with approval, that doing one's duty requires both moral clarity and emotional fortitude, and that integrity is often a solitary endeavor. Through the lens of their father's example and the town's reaction, they begin to see the intricate relationship between justice, social expectation, and personal responsibility, a realization that will shape their understanding of morality for years to come without ending. Tom Robinson's arrest is the moment when abstract fear and prejudice solidify into an unmistakable reality, a tangible event that ripples through Mockingbird and disrupts the fragile routines of daily life. I remember moments in my own childhood when a seemingly distant injustice suddenly became concrete, when the stories and lessons adults discussed became real through the presence of events too vivid to ignore. The children, Scout and Jem, sense immediately that this is no ordinary misfortune, that the arrest of Tom Robinson is both a personal and a communal turning point, a marker in the narrative of their lives where innocence begins to be tempered by the weight of the world around them. The arrest itself is handled with a formal kind of ritual that belies the human tragedy it represents. Officers arrive, procedures are followed, and yet behind the procedural facade lies a current of tension, judgment, and moral ambiguity. I remember observing as a child the way authority often carries a veneer of legitimacy, masking the deeper injustices at work. For Scout and Jem, the sight of Tom being led away under accusation introduces them to the uncomfortable truth that the law, while ostensibly blind, can be guided by prejudice, that rules and procedures do not guarantee fairness, and that human judgment, fraught with fear and bias, remains at the heart of justice. Atticus immediately becomes a focal point, both as Tom's advocate and as a symbol of moral courage in a town grappling with deeply ingrained racial hierarchies. I recall adults in my own life who, when confronted with an injustice, became the anchor for those around them, not only acting to right the wrong but also exemplifying integrity under pressure. Atticus embodies that same steadfastness, refusing to shy from the daunting responsibilities of defending a man whom society has already judged guilty. His commitment is not born of impulse or showmanship. It is deliberate, principled, and profoundly instructive to Scout and Jem, who watch as their father assumes a moral position that will invite both admiration and scorn. The children's awareness of community scrutiny deepens in the wake of Tom Robinson's arrest. I remember sensing as a child the way collective attention can press upon those involved in contentious events, how neighbors' opinions, whispered judgments, and visible gestures of approval or disapproval shape the perception of right and wrong. Scout and Jem notice these subtle dynamics everywhere they go, the cautious glances from acquaintances, the stiff politeness in the streets, the murmured conversations that halt when they approach. Through this, they begin to understand that justice does not exist in a vacuum, but is entangled with social expectations, fear, and entrenched prejudice, and that the courage of individuals often comes at the cost of public comfort. Preparations for the trial further expose the children to the weight of responsibility and the reality of human imperfection. I recall how, in my own youth, observing adults prepare for important undertakings taught lessons about diligence, patience, and the moral dimensions of action. The discussions Atticus shares with Scout and Jem, his careful consideration of the evidence, and his measured responses to public opinion illustrate the interplay between knowledge and principle. The children learn that doing what is right involves thoughtfulness, strategic awareness, and the ability to maintain one's convictions even when surrounded by doubt or hostility. It is a lesson in the complexity of justice and the emotional fortitude required to confront entrenched societal bias. The arrest also crystallizes for Scout and Jem the stark contrast within Maycomb. The divisions between those who value fairness and those who cling to prejudice, the quiet supporters and the vocal critics, the ethical steadfastness of individuals and the inertia of the collective. I remember observing similar contrasts in my own childhood communities, noting how people revealed their values in small actions, in words spoken softly or withheld, in gestures of support or avoidance. Tom Robinson's predicament serves as a catalyst for these observations, teaching the children that morality is lived through consistent choices, that courage is measured not in rhetoric but in action, and that injustice is often perpetuated by silence as much as by overt acts. Scout and Jem also begin to grasp the human cost of prejudice more intimately. I remember as a child experiencing moments when abstract concepts of wrong and right became painfully personal, when the stories of injustice shifted from newsprint or conversation into the realm of lived experience. Seeing Tom Robinson arrested, witnessing his dignity amid fear and uncertainty, and observing the strain on his family all communicate truths that words alone cannot convey. The children confront the reality that prejudice can destroy lives, corrode communities, and burden the innocent, and that moral clarity often requires both courage and empathy to navigate the emotional weight of such awareness. The journey toward the trial is marked by an increasing awareness of the performative aspects of justice. I recall how adults around me sometimes presented fairness and procedure with a sense of decorum that masked inequality, creating a tension between appearance and reality. Scout and Jem observed the same in Maycomb, the courthouse rituals, the formalities of legal proceedings, and the careful, deliberate comportment of Atticus as he prepares his case. These observations teach the children that the mechanisms of law are not inherently moral. They are tools whose ethical weight depends on the principles of those who wield them. Understanding this distinction is crucial for their growing comprehension of justice and the courage it requires to defend the innocent. In addition, the arrest underscores the moral isolation that often accompanies integrity. Atticus stands apart, unwavering in his commitment to Tom Robinson despite the social and political pressures around him. I remember recognizing as a child how rare it is for individuals to act with consistent principle, how easily peer pressure and the desire for acceptance can undermine moral courage. Scout and Jem begin to understand that doing what is right may isolate them, that justice may be unpopular, and that integrity is measured not by the approval of the majority, but by fidelity to conscience. These lessons resonate with the broader themes of Maycomb, revealing the personal stakes inherent in confronting systemic prejudice and injustice. The arrest also draws attention to the vulnerability of those targeted by society's biases. I recall learning as a child that some individuals carry burdens invisible to most, that the innocent can suffer simply because of identity or circumstance. Tom Robinson, accused without cause beyond his race, embodies this vulnerability, and his plight teaches Scout and Jem that the structures of society often fail those who are most deserving of protection. They begin to perceive that justice requires vigilance, courage, and advocacy, and that the moral responsibility of a community extends beyond passive disapproval of wrongs to active defense of the defenseless. Finally, the lead-up to the trial provides a context for the children to observe resilience in the face of adversity. I remember witnessing adults confront seemingly insurmountable challenges, learning that courage is as much about persistence as about heroism, about maintaining composure and principle when the outcome is uncertain and the odds are stacked against you. Atticus exemplifies this resilience, demonstrating that the path of integrity is rarely easy, that it demands preparation, patience, and a steadfast commitment to truth. Scout and Jem internalize these lessons as they follow the unfolding events of Tom Robinson's arrest and the trial's impending arrival, understanding that moral courage, the kind that shapes character, defines justice, is a daily practice, a quiet endurance, and an unwavering fidelity to principle without ending. The courtroom is a space charged with expectation, the air heavy with anticipation, the faces of the spectators a tapestry of hope, skepticism, and latent prejudice. I remember sitting in rooms as a child where adults discussed serious matters, feeling both the tension and the weight of moral responsibility that seemed to hang over every word. In Maycomb, the courtroom becomes not merely a venue for legal proceedings, but a stage where the hidden truths of the town, the contradictions of human behavior, and the fragile balance between justice and bias are laid bare. For Scout and Jem, entering this space is both exhilarating and disorienting, a moment when childhood innocence collides with the complexity of adult reality. The first voices to reach them are those of witnesses, each carrying a mixture of truth, memory, and personal interpretation. I remember learning as a child that people's recollections are often colored by emotion, fear, and self-interest, that what they claim to see may reflect not only events but also their own desires and prejudices. In the courtroom, Scout and Jem observe how testimony can illuminate and obscure, how the perception of reality is shaped as much by the speaker as by the facts themselves. The arrival of each witness creates ripples through the audience, revealing the town's divisions, the moral courage of individuals, and the subtleties of human perception. Atticus's questioning of witnesses introduces the children to the nuances of moral reasoning and logical clarity. I recall moments in my own youth when adults demonstrated the power of carefully constructed argument, showing that justice is not merely a matter of emotion, but of deliberate thought and meticulous attention to detail. Atticus dissects statements with patience and precision, revealing inconsistencies, challenging assumptions, and exposing the deeper truths hidden beneath surface narratives. Scout and Jem witness how integrity, calmness, and focus can cut through the noise of fear and prejudice, and they begin to understand that true advocacy requires not only courage but also intellect and empathy. The testimonies also reveal the stark realities of racial prejudice in Maycomb. I remember observing as a child how bias can distort perception and interpretation, how fear and entrenched social hierarchies can shape what is seen as credible or believable. Witnesses present their accounts with conviction, yet their words carry the invisible weight of societal expectation and inherited prejudice. Scout and Jem gradually perceive that truth is often filtered through these layers, that facts alone may not be enough to overcome the weight of bias, and that the struggle for justice is as much about confronting collective assumptions as it is about individual innocence or guilt. The children are particularly struck by the testimony of Tom Robinson himself, a man whose dignity and honesty shine despite the fear and hostility surrounding him. I remember moments in my youth when witnessing a person's courage and integrity left an impression far deeper than any abstract lesson, a reminder that character reveals itself most powerfully in moments of trial. Tom's words, calm and measured, contrast sharply with the hysteria and prejudice of others, and Scout and Jem begin to grasp the profound injustice in condemning a man for who he is rather than for what he has done. His presence in the courtroom embodies both the vulnerability of the oppressed and the quiet nobility of someone facing an impossible situation with steadfastness. The testimonies of Mayella Ewell and her father present the children with an intricate web of fear, shame, and social expectation. I remember realizing as a child that people often act out of a mixture of self-preservation, pride, and societal pressure, that their words and actions may conceal more than they reveal. Mayella's nervousness, her attempts to justify her claims, and the subtle hints of her isolation and desperation create a portrait of human complexity that challenges simplistic moral judgments. Bob Ewell's aggression and overt prejudice further illuminate the social and racial hierarchies that dominate Maycomb, revealing the dangerous intersections of fear, power, and entrenched bias. Scout and Jem begin to understand that the courtroom is not merely a place of law, but a crucible where human weakness, societal pressure, and moral courage collide. Atticus's defense strategy brings these elements into sharp relief, highlighting the contradictions and implausibilities in the testimonies. I remember being impressed as a child by adults who could navigate complexity with clarity, who could reveal truth, not by force, but by careful reasoning and patient exposition. He does not belittle witnesses, but instead exposes the inconsistencies in a way that demands the children in the town to think critically, to question assumptions, and to confront uncomfortable realities. Through this, Scout and Jem begin to see the power of reasoned argument, the courage it takes to challenge collective delusion, and the emotional resilience required to maintain composure under scrutiny. The courtroom also teaches lessons in empathy and human fallibility. Witnesses reveal their fears, limitations, and desires, and the children observe how these human dimensions complicate the simple dichotomy of right and wrong. I recall noticing as a child how understanding another person's motives and struggles could transform a situation from black and white into a tapestry of shades, creating both moral clarity and moral complexity. Scout and Jem internalize these lessons, realizing that judging human behavior requires more than observation. It requires imagination, patience, and a willingness to recognize the humanity in those who err. The children are not immune to the emotional weight of the proceedings. I remember feeling as a child the tension in rooms where justice hung in the balance, the mixture of anticipation, fear, and hope that made every word spoken seem significant. Scout and Jem experience a similar intensity, noticing the subtle cues in the audience, the restrained gestures of respect or disdain, and the fluctuating expressions of hope and despair. The courtroom becomes a living entity, reflecting the moral and emotional currents of Maycomb, and the children are forced to navigate these currents, learning to interpret both words and silences, statements and omissions, gestures and glances. As the testimonies progress, Scout and Jem begin to internalize the complex interplay of justice, prejudice, and morality. I remember the first moments as a child when abstract principles became real through observation, when the behavior of adults revealed lessons that no textbook could convey. They see how courage manifests not only in Atticus's steadfastness, but also in the quiet endurance of Tom Robinson, the awkward attempts at truth by Myella Ewell, and the moral inertia of those who sit silently, aware of injustice yet unwilling to act. These observations provide a foundation for their emerging understanding of right and wrong, the courage to confront prejudice, and the necessity of empathy in the pursuit of justice. The courtroom becomes a microcosm of the town itself, a concentrated reflection of Maycomb's fears, prejudices, and moral struggles. I remember recognizing as a child that small spaces can magnify the dynamics of society, revealing the tensions and contradictions that govern everyday life. Scout and Jem witness the collision of social expectation, individual courage, and the harsh reality of systemic inequality. They begin to understand that the pursuit of justice is rarely straightforward, that evidence alone cannot always overcome bias, and that moral clarity requires both intellectual rigor and emotional resilience. Finally, the key testimonies and revelations prepare the children for the larger truths they must eventually confront about their town, their society, and the human heart. I recall sensing as a child that the most enduring lessons are those learned not from abstract teaching, but from observing life in its unvarnished form, from witnessing both the nobility and the failings of those around us. Scout and Jem emerge from the courtroom changed, more aware of the complexity of justice, the courage required to uphold principle, and the profound influence of human prejudice and moral strength in shaping the world around them, understanding that the lessons of the trial will ripple through their consciousness, long after the final words have been spoken without ending. The courtroom grows still as Atticus rises to address the jury, the weight of expectation settling over every person present, each heartbeat echoing with the tension of anticipation. I remember as a child sitting in rooms where adults spoke with careful deliberation, the force of their conviction palpable, the words carrying both authority and moral gravity. Atticus's stance, calm yet resolute, signals to Scout and Jem that something profound is about to unfold, that the act of speaking the truth in the face of prejudice is itself a form of courage, a lesson that extends far beyond the immediate confines of the courtroom. The children sense immediately that this moment is different from the others. The testimonies have ended, the arguments presented, and now the essence of justice, principle, and moral clarity will be distilled in a voice that commands both attention and reflection. I recall similar feelings from my own youth, when adults articulated ideas with such careful precision that even those too young to understand every detail could feel the significance, the moral force, and the courage embedded in the act of speaking truthfully. Scout and Jem, through their father's example, begin to understand that words can carry the weight of conscience, that reasoning can illuminate what prejudice seeks to obscure, and that courage often manifests in measured expression rather than dramatic action. Atticus's argument does not rely on spectacle but on a methodical appeal to reason, fairness, and shared humanity. I remember noticing as a child how adults could convey principles through logic and empathy, how their careful framing of facts could challenge assumptions and inspire reflection. The children observed the deliberate pacing, the careful selection of words, and the moral underpinning of each point, recognizing that the act of defending Tom Robinson is as much about appealing to conscience as it is about presenting evidence. In this, Scout and Jem see a demonstration of courage that requires patience, clarity, and an unwavering commitment to principle, revealing that true advocacy is an art grounded in both intellect and integrity. The argument also exposes the contradictions and fallacies in the prosecution's case. I remember learning in my own youth that careful scrutiny could reveal the weaknesses of seemingly solid assertions, that attention to detail and logical consistency often illuminate truths obscured by rhetoric or bias. Atticus carefully dismantles the assumptions that underpin the accusations against Tom Robinson, showing how prejudice, fear, and societal expectation have shaped the narrative in ways that distort reality. Scout and Jem perceive that justice requires not only moral courage, but also the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge ingrained beliefs, and to advocate for fairness even when it meets resistance or hostility. One of the most striking aspects of the plea is its appeal to empathy. I recall moments in childhood when adults invited others to consider perspectives different from their own, creating bridges of understanding through the simple yet profound act of imagination. Atticus asks the jury to step into Tom Robinson's shoes, to see the world from the vantage of a man condemned not for actions but for identity, to recognize the humanity that prejudice seeks to erase. Scout and Jem are drawn into this appeal, understanding that empathy is both a moral obligation and a form of courage, that perceiving the plight of another demands attention, imagination, and a willingness to challenge societal norms. The argument also illustrates the moral isolation often inherent in standing for justice. Atticus is aware that the majority may resist his plea, that the jury may be influenced by prejudice rather than evidence. I remember observing as a child the way adults sometimes bore responsibility alone, acting in accordance with conscience despite social pressure, misunderstanding, or outright hostility. Scout and Jem see that doing what is right is rarely rewarded with applause, that integrity can be lonely, and that courage often entails perseverance in the face of indifference or opposition. This lesson resonates deeply, teaching them that moral action is measured by fidelity to principle rather than by public approval. The children also begin to understand the profound consequences of standing for justice in a deeply flawed society. I recall learning that adults often carried burdens invisible to the young, that ethical decisions could provoke backlash, danger, and personal sacrifice. Atticus's plea highlights the stakes for Tom Robinson and for the broader community, revealing the social and moral tensions that define Maycomb. Scout and Jem grasp that justice is not abstract but lived, that defending truth and equity can challenge entire social structures, and that the courage to act in accordance with conscience has implications far beyond the immediate moment. The courtroom itself becomes a stage for moral revelation. I remember as a child sensing the weight of collective attention, the way human behavior could be amplified in moments of scrutiny, how ethical principles became tangible through observation of action and speech. Scout and Jem watched the jurors, the spectators, and their father, absorbing the gravity of the moment, recognizing that the act of speaking truth in the face of prejudice is both a performance of conscience and a lesson in personal responsibility. They begin to see that the law, while imperfect, can serve as a platform for moral argument, that clarity of thought and depth of empathy are as vital as legal procedure, and that courage is often most profound when exercised quietly yet decisively. Atticus's closing argument also reveals the limitations of human justice. I remember observing adults who struggled to reconcile principle with custom, morality with convenience, and fairness with social expectation. Scout and Jem perceive that the jury's decision, while hoped for, is not guaranteed to reflect truth or morality, that prejudice may prevail despite evidence and reason. This awareness deepens their understanding of the fragility of justice and the necessity of resilience, showing them that the pursuit of fairness requires continuous effort, moral vigilance, and the courage to act even when outcomes are uncertain. The children absorb lessons not only from the words themselves but from the manner in which they are delivered. I recall learning as a child that the force of conviction is conveyed as much by demeanor as by argument, by calm composure, patience, and unshakable integrity, rather than by loud or forceful gestures. Scout and Jem notice Atticus's steady voice, measured cadence, and unwavering eye contact, and they begin to internalize the principle that moral authority is grounded in consistency, clarity, and ethical courage. The courtroom, in this sense, becomes a laboratory for observing the interplay of principle, persuasion, and human psychology, a place where the children learn that moral action is both deliberate and performative, in its own quiet way. Finally, the plea crystallizes for Scout and Jem the centrality of empathy, integrity, and courage in the pursuit of justice. I remember moments in my own childhood when observing the steadfastness of adults left indelible impressions, teaching lessons about responsibility, human dignity, and the moral imperative to act rightly even when society resists. The closing argument embodies these lessons, showing the children that advocating for fairness requires intellect, patience, and moral clarity, that courage is measured by adherence to principle rather than popularity, and that justice is an ongoing struggle demanding both observation and action. Through this, Scout and Jem begin to understand that standing for what is right is a continual exercise in conscience, empathy, and courage. A lesson whose resonance will extend far beyond the walls of the courtroom without ending. The moment the jury delivers its verdict, the air in the courtroom becomes thick with a weight that feels almost physical, as though the walls themselves are holding the collective breath of Maycomb. I remember as a child observing moments when a single announcement or event shifted the emotional landscape of a room, when anticipation became realization and innocence collided with harsh reality. For Scout and Jem, the verdict is not just a statement of legal judgment. It is a sudden, undeniable exposure to the forces of prejudice, fear, and entrenched social hierarchy that govern their town. The abstract lessons of fairness and morality are transformed into something tangible, immediate, and irrevocably personal. The children sense the tension even before the words are spoken, noticing the solemn expressions of the jurors, the strained faces of spectators, and the barely contained emotions that ripple through the room. I recall experiencing as a child the way subtle cues in adults could convey a truth too complex for words, the silent communication of dread, hope, or despair that children absorb instinctively. Scout and Jem, attuned to these signals, feel the gravity of the moment and begin to understand that the structures of justice are not purely rational, but deeply entwined with human frailty, societal pressure, and collective fear. When the verdict is finally announced, it strikes with a force both immediate and numbing. I remember feeling similar shocks in my own youth, when witnessing the outcome of situations that seemed unfair, realizing that life does not always reward virtue or punish wrongdoing. The courtroom erupts in whispers, sighs, and suppressed reactions, a mixture of relief for some and anguish for others. Scout and Jem are confronted with the stark reality that fairness is often subverted by prejudice, that moral clarity does not guarantee just outcomes, and that the principles their father upholds are not universally shared or appreciated. The injustice of the verdict is compounded by the children's growing awareness of the social context that shapes it. I recall moments as a child when observing adults revealed the ways in which fear, tradition, and groupthink could dominate reason, twisting the outcomes of decisions that seemed, in principle, straightforward. Scout and Jem begin to see that the jury's decision is not merely an individual act, but a reflection of the collective biases of Maycomb, of the unspoken rules that govern behavior, and of the deeply rooted racial hierarchies that dictate who is considered credible, worthy, or deserving. Atticus's response to the verdict models a kind of moral fortitude that is both instructive and quietly painful to witness. I remember adults who faced injustice with composure, demonstrating to young observers that integrity and courage are not measured by external outcomes, but by adherence to principle. He remains calm and composed, offering reassurance to the children while acknowledging the harsh truth of the situation. Scout and Jem absorb the lesson that resilience in the face of unfairness is a form of courage, that standing for what is right is meaningful even when the immediate results are disappointing, and that moral strength is often tested most severely in moments of apparent defeat. The children also perceive the emotional toll on those directly affected by the verdict. Tom Robinson, dignified even in his despair, becomes a symbol of both human vulnerability and quiet heroism. I recall the first time I understood as a child that innocence and integrity could be powerless against entrenched societal prejudice, that human suffering is often multiplied by the unfair judgments of others. Scout and Jem feel the weight of this realization, recognizing the fragility of justice in a society structured by fear and discrimination, and beginning to grasp the personal dimensions of racial and social inequity that their father has long prepared them to understand intellectually. The broader town reacts in ways that reveal the pervasive nature of prejudice and moral compromise. I remember learning in my youth how communities often preserve comfort at the expense of justice, how collective anxiety and ingrained belief can override truth and fairness. Some spectators express satisfaction or relief, their responses underscoring the complicity of ordinary citizens in perpetuating injustice. Others are visibly shaken, aware of the discrepancy between fact and judgment, yet unable or unwilling to challenge it openly. Scout and Jem, navigating these reactions, begin to comprehend the moral complexity of society, the interplay of courage and cowardice, and the challenge of advocating for justice in an environment resistant to change. The emotional landscape of the courtroom highlights the personal dimension of systemic injustice. I recall understanding as a child that structures of authority and social convention often fail those who are most vulnerable, that human institutions are imperfect mirrors of ethical principles. Scout and Jem witness how the verdict affects not only Tom Robinson and his family, but also their father, whose moral conviction stands firm despite societal rejection. They perceive the cost of integrity, the isolation that accompanies moral courage, and the subtle ways in which communities resist the demands of fairness. These observations deepen their understanding of human complexity, empathy, and the ethical responsibility to challenge inequity, even when the odds are stacked against them. The aftermath of the verdict exposes Scout and Jem to the harsh realities of prejudice and fear beyond the courtroom. I remember the first time I sensed that injustice was not confined to extraordinary events, but embedded in the rhythms of everyday life, in whispers, gestures, and unspoken rules. The children encounter subtle hostility from peers, critical remarks from neighbors, and the quiet, pervasive acknowledgement that Maycomb's social order privileges some while condemning others. They begin to understand that justice is fragile, that moral action is often solitary, and that the pursuit of fairness demands both courage and persistence in the face of entrenched societal forces. Scout and Jem also reflect on the role of hope and resilience in confronting injustice. I recall experiences in my youth when adults demonstrated that despair need not be absolute, that even in the face of systemic failure, one could act with integrity and dignity. Atticus's steadfastness becomes a model for endurance, illustrating that moral courage is as much about persistence as about immediate triumph. The children recognize that the verdict, while unjust, does not erase principle, and that standing for truth and fairness remains vital, even when society resists it. This realization plants the seeds of a broader understanding of ethical responsibility, the necessity of empathy, and the importance of maintaining conscience against the tide of prejudice. The trial's outcome also illuminates the limitations of innocence in the face of societal bias. I remember first understanding as a child that human fairness is conditional, that virtue does not guarantee protection, and that moral clarity often encounters resistance in imperfect social systems. Scout and Jem confront the painful reality that goodness alone cannot reshape prejudice, that societal structures and communal fears often determine outcomes more than truth or reason, and that the lessons of justice require both patience and ongoing reflection. This awareness transforms their understanding of morality, from abstract principle into lived experience, embedding the notion that integrity is valuable even when recognition and reward are absent. Finally, the verdict shapes the children's moral consciousness in ways that extend beyond the courtroom, the trial, and the immediate consequences for Tom Robinson. I remember the first time I perceived as a child that lessons learned in moments of injustice carry the power to shape character for a lifetime. Scout and Jem internalized the profound dissonance between principle and outcome, learning that courage, empathy, and commitment to fairness are indispensable even when society falters. They begin to recognize that moral responsibility is continuous, that the pursuit of justice is rarely linear, and that human goodness often must contend with entrenched fear and prejudice. The verdict becomes not merely an event in their childhood, but a foundational experience, a lens through which they will interpret fairness, courage, and human character for years to come without ending. The days following the trial are heavy with a quiet that feels different from the ordinary rhythms of Maycomb, a kind of stillness that carries both sorrow and reflection. I remember as a child noticing how certain events cast long shadows over daily life, how the air seems charged with understanding before words are spoken, how even simple routines feel different because the heart of a community has been unsettled. For Scout and Jem, the trial's conclusion is not a distant story, but a lived reality, one that permeates the conversations, the streets, and even the air they breathe, marking a moment where childhood innocence is irrevocably altered by the weight of human injustice. Tom Robinson's fate, cruel and inevitable in the context of Maycomb's prejudice, strikes the children with a mixture of sorrow, confusion, and anger. I remember the first time I was confronted with the idea that life often punishes the innocent while leaving the guilty unscathed, that fairness is not an automatic consequence of right action. Scout and Jem struggle to reconcile their father's steadfast morality with the harsh reality that the legal system and communal bias have conspired to destroy a life. They perceive that human institutions, however well-intentioned, are subject to fear, ignorance, and prejudice, and that moral clarity does not always translate into protection or justice. The emotional impact on the Finch family is profound and instructive. Atticus, who has stood firm in principle throughout, embodies quiet endurance, demonstrating to his children that courage is not measured in triumph, but in fidelity to conscience. I remember adults in my youth whose steadiness in adversity left indelible marks on young observers, showing that resilience and moral courage are often quieter than dramatic, more enduring than fleeting victory. Scout and Jem absorb this lesson in real time, recognizing that integrity can be costly, that acting rightly may invite scorn or isolation, and that standing for justice is meaningful even when it fails to alter immediate outcomes. The community's reaction reveals both the pervasive nature of prejudice and the complexities of human sympathy. I recall observing as a child how some individuals respond to tragedy with indifference, others with compassion, and still others with quiet, cautious support that is easily overlooked. In Maycomb, some townspeople express relief at the verdict, their responses reflecting fear, bias, or entrenched social hierarchy, while others quietly acknowledge the injustice, offering what small comforts they can. Scout and Jem witness these reactions and begin to understand the multiplicity of human motives, the subtle ways morality and cowardice intersect, and the importance of observing the world with both discernment and empathy. The aftermath also exposes the children to the social consequences of their father's moral courage. I remember recognizing in my youth that ethical action often comes with social cost, that choosing principle over convenience can lead to tension, ostracism, or hostility. The Finch family navigates subtle shifts in social dynamics, encountering disapproval from neighbors, whispered criticism in the streets, and both admiration and gratitude from those who understand the stakes. Scout and Jem learn that moral action is rarely neutral, that defending the innocent can disrupt the comfortable assumptions of a community, and that integrity may invite challenge, ridicule, or even danger. The personal dimensions of Tom Robinson's fate also become more vivid in this period. I recall the first time I understood that the suffering of another could elicit deep empathy and moral outrage, that awareness of injustice could awaken a sense of responsibility and compassion. Scout and Jem feel the weight of Tom's predicament keenly, imagining the fear, despair, and helplessness he must endure. They see the human cost of prejudice, the toll of a society that condemns a man for the color of his skin, and begin to understand that moral lessons are inseparable from human experience, that empathy and action are inseparably linked in the pursuit of justice. The children also witness the broader ramifications of the trial for Macomb itself. I remember as a child observing how communities can be reshaped by events that challenge social norms, how conversations, glances, and unspoken understandings shift after moments of collective tension. In the days following the trial, Scout and Jem perceive fractures in social cohesion, subtle but pervasive, and notice that relationships, previously assumed to be stable, are now tinged with discomfort or caution. The trial has exposed the latent biases, fears, and moral compromises that shape daily life, and the children are acutely aware that change, if it comes at all, will be slow and contested. Atticus continues to guide his children through this moral landscape, offering lessons not through words alone, but through the example of his conduct. I recall adults in my youth whose lives taught more than their speeches, whose consistency and ethical commitment imparted lasting understanding. Scout and Jem watch as their father maintains patience, dignity, and integrity, demonstrating that one can act with principle even in a world that rewards neither courage nor fairness. They internalize the idea that moral strength involves persistence, empathy, and careful discernment, and that the pursuit of justice is ongoing, requiring both vigilance and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths repeatedly. The emotional maturation of Scout and Jem is accelerated by their engagement with the aftermath. I remember moments in my own youth when the consequences of injustice became personal, teaching lessons about human complexity, resilience, and the necessity of maintaining conscience amidst adversity. The children grapple with anger, sadness, and confusion, learning to channel these feelings into understanding and reflection, rather than despair or cynicism. They begin to see that moral clarity requires both recognition of injustice and commitment to ethical action, that understanding human failure is as important as celebrating human virtue, and that courage is as much about endurance as it is about bold gestures. The Finch family's interactions with the community in the aftermath of the trial further illuminate the subtle dynamics of social morality. I recall noticing as a child how individuals navigate complex social landscapes, balancing personal ethics with the pressures of communal expectation. Scout and Jem witness neighbors offering quiet support or veiled disapproval, observing that human behavior often reflects both conscience and fear. These experiences teach the children that morality is not always public or dramatic, but frequently exists in the choices and compromises made daily, that courage and decency can be practiced in subtle, unheralded ways, and that the pursuit of justice is sustained not by singular acts, but by consistent, principled living. The fate of Tom Robinson becomes a lens through which Scout and Jem examine the broader patterns of human behavior. I remember first perceiving as a child that society is composed of both the noble and the flawed, that virtue and prejudice coexist in complex ways, and that understanding human character requires both observation and reflection. They see the courage of Atticus, the quiet suffering of Tom, and the cowardice or complicity of others, beginning to piece together a nuanced understanding of morality, justice, and human responsibility. These observations provide the children with a foundation for ethical reasoning that will inform their judgments and choices long after childhood, shaping their understanding of fairness, empathy, and the demands of conscience. Finally, the aftermath of the trial and Tom Robinson's fate crystallizes for Scout and Jem the inseparability of justice, empathy, and moral courage. I recall experiences in my own youth when witnessing both human failure and integrity left enduring impressions, shaping my understanding of right and wrong. The children internalize that confronting prejudice, advocating for fairness, and maintaining personal integrity are ongoing tasks, that the consequences of inaction are real, and that moral responsibility requires awareness, resilience, and action, even when outcomes are uncertain. Through this period, they learn that human justice is fragile, that courage often goes unnoticed, and that understanding and confronting inequality is a lifelong endeavor, a lesson that will resonate through their consciousness and inform their ethical development without ending. The days and months following Tom Robinson's trial become a quiet, insistent teacher for Jem and Scout, shaping their understanding of Maycomb, of people, and of themselves in ways that are subtle, persistent, and transformative. I remember as a child, noticing the slow shift in perception that accompanies experience, how a single event, observed closely, can ripple through the mind and heart over time, altering the way one interprets the familiar and the everyday. Jem, who had once taken pride in the simplicity of right and wrong, begins to see the world in shades of gray, realizing that fairness and justice are not guaranteed by law or custom but require vigilance, courage, and empathy. Scout, whose curiosity has always driven her engagement with the world, begins to temper her impulsive observations with a growing awareness of the complexities of human behavior, of the invisible burdens that others carry, and of the subtle pressures that shape actions and words. The children's perspective on the town itself becomes more nuanced. I recall how, as a child, the first awareness of adult hypocrisy and the contradictions of social life created both disillusionment and understanding. Maycomb, once a predictable and comforting landscape, now reveals fissures and tensions previously unnoticed. Jem notices the glances, the muttered comments, the cautious politeness that masks judgment, and begins to understand that society is governed as much by fear and tradition as by law or reason. Scout, who had relied on instinct and emotion to navigate her world, begins to perceive that human behavior is layered, that words may conceal motives, and that empathy requires deliberate attention and reflection. Their growing understanding is both exhilarating and unsettling, a reminder that maturity often carries the weight of insight as well as freedom. Jem's emotional and moral development accelerates in ways that are both visible and internal. I remember moments in my own youth when an event left a lasting impression, shaping attitudes, emotional responses, and ethical judgments for years to come. Jem becomes more reflective, more sensitive to injustice, and more aware of the responsibilities inherent in his observations. He questions the fairness of the town. He struggles with the irrationality of prejudice, and he begins to imagine how life might differ in a world governed by true justice. This inner questioning signals a profound shift from the innocence of childhood to the contemplative engagement of adolescence, a transformation marked by both courage and vulnerability, hope and disillusionment. Scout, meanwhile, begins to refine her understanding of human behavior and social expectation. I recall the first stirrings of awareness in my own life, when one begins to notice the subtle forces shaping conduct, the unseen pressures that mold choices, and the quiet compromises that accompany survival in society. Scout sees how prejudice, fear, and conformity influence actions even among those she respects and admires, and she learns to weigh words and gestures carefully, to look beyond immediate impressions, and to consider the broader context of human behavior. Her natural curiosity is now joined by discernment, empathy, and a developing moral compass that seeks understanding before judgment. The children's relationship with Atticus evolves as they internalize the lessons of his example. I remember the way certain adults in my childhood conveyed moral truth through consistency and quiet integrity, leaving a lasting impression without didactic instruction. Atticus's calm endurance, his unwavering commitment to principle despite social opposition, and his insistence on empathy as a measure of justice become living lessons for Jem and Scout. They recognize that courage is not flamboyant or performative, but steady and principled, that moral action may invite criticism or isolation, and that integrity is tested not in triumph, but in persistence and in the quiet choices made daily. These observations shape their understanding of human character, the value of ethical consistency, and the enduring importance of conscience. Their engagement with peers also reflects their changing perspectives. I recall noticing as a child how experiences of injustice and observation of adult behavior could influence relationships and social understanding, teaching lessons about trust, loyalty, and moral alignment. Jem and Scout become more discerning, noticing who reflects fairness, empathy, and courage, and who succumbs to prejudice, fear, or self-interest. They begin to navigate friendships with heightened awareness, recognizing the moral and social currents that influence behavior, learning to value substance over appearance, and developing a capacity to resist peer pressure while maintaining empathy and understanding. The children also confront the limitations of childhood, knowledge, and the inadequacy of simplistic moral categories. I remember the first time I realized that virtue and vice are often intertwined, that courage and cowardice coexist, and that fairness can be obstructed by fear or habit. Scout and Jem learn that people are rarely wholly good or evil, that human behavior is shaped by circumstance, upbringing, and social context, and that judgments must account for complexity as well as principle. This recognition challenges their prior assumptions, forcing them to grapple with disappointment, ambiguity, and moral uncertainty, while also cultivating the discernment that forms the foundation of mature ethical reasoning. The growing awareness of societal injustice influences their imagination and play. I recall how experiences in my own childhood shaped the stories and games I created, coloring them with a sense of awareness, responsibility, and empathy beyond my years. Jem and Scout incorporate lessons of courage, fairness, and moral struggle into their understanding of the world around them, revisiting earlier adventures with new insight, reconsidering neighbors and community members in light of experience, and learning to interpret the ordinary and the extraordinary through a lens shaped by observation, reflection, and emerging ethical understanding. Their evolving sense of morality becomes intertwined with empathy. I remember the moments in childhood when witnessing suffering or injustice awakened a persistent concern for others, a sense of responsibility that could not be ignored. Scout and Jem begin to measure actions not only by intent or law, but by their effect on others, to imagine perspectives beyond their own, and to recognize that moral duty extends beyond self-interest. They see that empathy is both a shield and a guide, that understanding another's pain can inform choices, and that the cultivation of conscience requires attention, reflection, and deliberate practice in everyday life. The children's awareness of inequality and prejudice also deepens in practical and emotional terms. I recall the first times I recognized as a child that the world was structured in ways that privileged some while burdening others, that fairness was not automatically enforced, and that courage often involves speaking out against collective complacency. Jem and Scout witness subtle exclusions, casual cruelties, and systemic barriers in Maycomb, learning to perceive injustice, even when it is quiet or socially sanctioned. They begin to understand that ethical life requires vigilance, that witnessing unfairness carries responsibility, and that courage and empathy must be exercised, not selectively, but consistently, even when inconvenient or uncomfortable. Their changing perspectives extend to their understanding of themselves. I remember as a child feeling the first stirrings of self-awareness and ethical identity, realizing that one's choices and reactions matter, and that personal integrity is tested in everyday life. Jem and Scout confront the tension between youthful impulses and emerging moral discernment, balancing curiosity, instinct, and empathy with reflection, patience, and understanding. They learn that growing up entails accepting responsibility, interpreting experience with discernment, and cultivating a moral compass that can guide them through both adversity and ordinary life. Finally, the period following the trial and the children's engagement with its aftermath solidifies lessons about courage, empathy, and moral responsibility. I recall how enduring impressions from childhood shaped my understanding of human nature, of justice, and of personal obligation. Scout and Jem internalize the notion that the world is often unfair, that prejudice can distort truth, and that moral action requires both awareness and steadfastness. They recognize that growing up involves negotiating complexity, confronting injustice, and cultivating a conscience capable of discernment, courage, and compassion. Understanding that their experiences in Maycomb will continue to shape their perceptions, values, and ethical development long after childhood, without ending. The presence of Bob Ewell after the trial is like a shadow that moves through the streets of Maycomb, a quiet menace that makes itself felt in the rustling of leaves, the sideways glances of townsfolk, and the undercurrent of tension in every familiar space. I remember as a child sensing danger in the smallest gestures, in the weight of a look or the abruptness of a word, and understanding that fear is often less about immediate violence than the anticipation of it. For Scout and Jem, Ewell's presence introduces a new dimension to their understanding of human character, one that combines vindictiveness, cowardice, and the unsettling reality that cruelty can linger long after a moment of injustice seems to have passed. Bob Ewell's behavior is erratic, fueled by humiliation and resentment. and yet it is also calculated in its own crude way. I remember noticing in my youth how some people, though lacking refinement or education, could still harness their anger with precision, directing it toward those they perceive as having wronged them. Scout and Jem observe the subtle yet deliberate intimidation, the words meant to wound, and the gestures that carry unspoken threats. They begin to understand that malice does not always announce itself boldly but can be persistent, shadowing everyday life, and that courage involves recognizing and responding to danger even when it is not overtly declared. The children see their father's measured response to Yule's antagonism as a lesson in restraint and dignity. I recall adults in my own childhood whose wisdom lay not in confrontation, but in careful assessment, in knowing when to act and when to let the weight of principle guide them. Atticus does not respond with anger or provocation. He allows Yule's actions to reveal the man's character for what it is, demonstrating that strength is often quiet, moral, and patient. Scout and Jem absorb the lesson that the true measure of courage is maintaining integrity in the face of provocation, understanding that justice is not always immediate and that protecting one's family and community sometimes requires calm vigilance rather than impulsive retaliation. The threat of Bob Ewell also illuminates the persistence of prejudice in Maycomb. I remember noticing as a child how societal bias lingers, shaping interactions and perpetuating resentment long after individual events have passed. Ewell embodies the rawest form of resentment and defiance, a man who has internalized social hierarchies and responds with vindictive aggression when confronted with challenges to his presumed superiority. Scout and Jem perceive that prejudice is not simply an abstract idea but a force that can manifest in behavior, threatening safety, civility, and community cohesion. Their understanding of human danger expands to include both physical risk and the corrosive effect of hatred on moral and social life. The tension escalates subtly at first, in incidents that hint at Ewell's intent without revealing its full measure. I recall early experiences in my own youth when foreboding was sensed before events fully unfolded, when the smallest disruption suggested larger upheaval. Scout and Jem noticed the marks of his presence, a scowl in the marketplace, whispered comments, lingering stares, and moments of deliberate disruption. Each instance contributes to a growing awareness that Maycomb's social order, fragile under the weight of prejudice and fear, is vulnerable to the impulses of those who wield their anger without moral constraint. The children learn that danger can be insidious, that vigilance is necessary, and that moral courage includes the ability to anticipate and mitigate harm without descending into malice oneself. Atticus's handling of the threat reinforces lessons in ethical and practical discernment. I remember adults whose capacity for reasoned judgment taught younger observers about navigating conflict, balancing principle with pragmatism. He does not escalate Ewell's provocations, but positions himself and his family with quiet preparation, mindful of both immediate and potential consequences. Scout and Jem observe the careful calibration of their father's conduct, recognizing that courage and morality are not merely reactive, but require foresight, patience, and strategic judgment. They begin to understand that ethical action is not impulsive, but informed, measured, and attentive to the broader consequences of both intervention and restraint. The children also learn from the community's reaction to Ewell. I remember noticing in my own childhood how collective awareness can both amplify and mitigate danger, how neighbors' attitudes and responses shape the dynamics of conflict. Some townspeople view Ewell with caution, others with contempt, and still others with indifference, reflecting the uneven moral landscape that Jem and Scout are coming to understand. They perceive that human courage is not only personal but social, that moral action often involves both individual choice and the capacity to navigate collective attitudes, and that threats must be assessed within a broader ethical and communal context. The presence of Ewell transforms ordinary spaces into arenas of subtle tension. I recall experiences in my youth where familiar places became charged with awareness of potential danger, where the ordinary routine of life was shadowed by apprehension. Scout and Jem notice that streets, porches, and paths home from school carry unspoken warnings, that the everyday rhythm of Maycomb is now punctuated by caution. They internalize the lesson that vigilance is part of growing up, that awareness of human weakness and malice is necessary, and that moral and physical safety requires attention, judgment, and courage intertwined. Bob Ewell's threat also serves as a counterpoint to the children's emerging understanding of justice, empathy, and courage. I remember the moments in my childhood when observing cruelty clarified the value of compassion and moral steadfastness. Jem and Scout contrast Ewell's vindictiveness with Atticus's principled patience, with the quiet dignity of Tom Robinson in the trial, and with the compassion of neighbors who act quietly to support what is right. They learn that moral courage is not measured by intimidation or aggression, but by integrity, empathy, and the willingness to act ethically despite personal risk or social pressure. The children begin to understand the broader implications of Ewell's actions. I remember recognizing in my youth that individual malice can reflect societal flaws, that one person's aggression is often a symptom of larger inequities and failures. Ewell embodies the entanglement of ignorance, fear, and social resentment, and Scout and Jem perceive that confronting such threats requires both moral and practical comprehension. They begin to see that the challenges of justice extend beyond formal law, encompassing vigilance, ethical discernment, and the cultivation of empathy to counteract the corrosive effects of hatred and vindictiveness in their community. Their engagement with the threat also accelerates their emotional and moral maturation. I recall noticing as a child how experiences of danger, tension, and ethical complexity hastened understanding, sharpened judgment, and deepened empathy. Scout and Jem confront fear, evaluate human motives, and measure the consequences of action and inaction. They learn that growing up entails not only recognizing danger but responding with discernment, that courage is intertwined with foresight, and that moral and physical safety are inseparable from the principles of empathy, patience, and ethical judgment. Finally, the presence of Bob Ewell shapes the children's perception of the delicate balance between human courage and human malice. I remember early impressions of adulthood in my own life, when understanding the coexistence of good and evil became unavoidable, when the lessons of fairness, empathy, and resilience were tested against the reality of human cruelty. Scout and Jem internalized the duality of their world, recognizing that while Ewell represents the persistence of hatred and fear, the responses of Atticus, Boo Radley, and other principled figures reveal the sustaining power of courage, integrity, and compassion. They come to understand that maturity involves navigating this duality with awareness, vigilance, and moral steadfastness, learning that human threats must be met with both prudence and principle, and that the cultivation of courage, empathy, and ethical discernment is a lifelong endeavor without ending. The night of the attack arrives like a quiet storm, the kind that lingers in the shadows before manifesting, a tension felt in every rustle of leaves, every creaking branch, every distant footstep. I remember as a child sensing the way anticipation can sharpen the senses, how danger, though unseen, makes the familiar strange and charged, and how fear can settle deep in the bones before it even shows itself in the world outside. Scout and Jem, unaware of the precise nature of the threat, feel the weight of something ominous in the air, an instinctive awareness of danger that grows from subtle cues and small intimations, from the hushed tones of their father and the restless movements of neighbors, shaping a night that will test courage, judgment, and human character in ways they cannot yet comprehend. The children move through the house with heightened alertness, each sound amplified, each shadow suspicious. I remember those first encounters with fear in my own childhood, when imagination and reality intersected, creating a heightened perception of the world that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Jem, older and more attuned to consequence, senses the gravity of the situation and attempts to protect Scout with a combination of instinct and reason. Scout, guided by both curiosity and trust in her brother, navigates the tension with a blend of anxiety and alertness, feeling the night press in, understanding that the ordinary certainties of their world have been disrupted and that human malevolence can appear with sudden, shocking force. Bob Ewell, driven by vengeance and cruelty, becomes the embodiment of all that is dangerous, irrational, and violent. I remember realizing as a child that malevolence can manifest suddenly, that the intentions of others may be guided by spite or fear rather than reason, and that survival often depends on instinct, attention, and courage. Scout and Jem encounter this threat directly, experiencing fear in its raw, immediate form, feeling the vulnerability of their bodies, the fragility of their safety, and the pressing weight of the unknown. In this confrontation, the abstract lessons of morality, justice, and empathy acquired over the years crystallize into lived experience, showing that courage is inseparable from action, and that ethical principles are tested most profoundly in moments of imminent danger. The response to the attack demonstrates the quiet heroism that can emerge in the face of fear. I recall instances from my own childhood when individuals acted with calm decisiveness under pressure, when courage was expressed not in bravado, but in steady, purposeful action. Boo Radley, whose presence had been an enigma and a source of childhood fascination, becomes the unexpected protector, stepping into the darkness with a combination of moral clarity and physical courage that astonishes Scout and Jem. They witness the embodiment of selflessness, empathy, and quiet strength, learning that heroism is often unobtrusive, guided by conscience rather than recognition, and that the capacity to act decisively and rightly is a hallmark of true courage. The children's perception of fear and its consequences deepens in these moments. I remember recognizing in my own youth how fear can clarify priorities, focus attention, and heighten both perception and response. Scout feels the interplay of terror and trust, the instinctual reliance on others coupled with emerging awareness of her own capacities, and she begins to understand that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act rightly in spite of it. Jem, similarly, balances instinct, experience, and moral understanding, realizing that protecting others is a responsibility that may demand both physical and ethical bravery. The night becomes an accelerated lesson in human vulnerability and resilience, in the interdependence of morality, empathy, and courage. The attack also illuminates the nature of Bob Ewell's character in contrast to those who act heroically. I recall observing in my own childhood how malice and fear can coexist in a single person, how resentment and weakness often fuel aggression, and how cruelty is most visible when directed at those least able to defend themselves. Ewell's violence, born of spite and humiliation, is antithetical to the quiet dignity and moral fortitude displayed by Boo Radley, Atticus, and even the children in their responses. Scout and Jem perceive the stark contrast, learning that evil often seeks to dominate through fear, but can be mitigated or overcome by courage, principle, and the protective instincts of those who act ethically. The night also reveals the limits and strengths of human perception. I remember realizing in my youth that understanding a situation fully often requires observation, reflection, and interpretation. That immediate perception is filtered through emotion, experience, and instinct. Scout experiences the confusion and heightened awareness of the moment, the inability to fully discern what is happening, and yet finds clarity through trust in others and attention to instinct. Jem experiences a similar balance, relying on both learned knowledge and immediate reaction, understanding that wisdom often emerges in the crucible of fear and necessity. The children's growing discernment is honed in real time, transforming abstract lessons into concrete understanding of courage, protection, and moral responsibility. The physicality of the attack amplifies the moral dimensions of the experience. I recall the first time I noticed that danger was not only an ethical test but also a practical one, that human courage is embodied, enacted, and experienced through the senses. Scout and Jem feel the immediacy of risk, the weight of threat, and the relief and awe of intervention, recognizing that moral courage often requires action as well as conscience, and that heroism is inseparable from both physical and ethical vigilance. The protective actions of Boo Radley, the enduring calm of Atticus in their minds, and their own attempts to respond appropriately, all converge into an understanding that bravery is multifaceted, combining perception, decision, and execution under pressure. The aftermath of the attack is also instructive. I remember as a child observing how events, once concluded, reveal their full implications over time, how reflection brings insight, and how consequences extend beyond the immediate moment. Scout and Jem process the event with a mixture of relief, wonder, and deepened understanding of human nature, recognizing both the persistence of malice in the world and the enduring presence of courage, empathy, and moral fortitude. They begin to integrate these experiences into their understanding of society, justice, and personal responsibility, realizing that life is a continual negotiation between fear and ethical action, between threat and protection, between malice and virtue. The children also reflect on the enigmatic figure of Boo Radley. I recall the slow unfolding of comprehension in my own youth, the realization that those we imagine in one way may possess depths and virtues invisible until circumstance reveals them. Boo, once a source of myth and childish speculation, becomes a tangible, active protector, a living lesson in empathy, courage, and the quiet fulfillment of moral duty. Scout and Jem understand that heroism can reside where least expected, that appearances may deceive, and that the capacity for good is often exercised in secrecy, without recognition, and in profound humility. Finally, the night of the attack cements lessons about fear, courage, and human character. I remember moments when my own understanding of bravery and morality crystallized through experience, when observation and reflection revealed the complexity of human motives and the interplay of ethics and action. Scout and Jem internalize that fear is not weakness, that courage is the choice to act rightly despite danger, and that heroism can be quiet, unheralded, and transformative. They see that evil and malice persist in the world, that protection and justice often rely on vigilance and moral clarity, and that the most profound acts of courage emerge when ethical principle, empathy, and human action converge under pressure, shaping their understanding of life, morality, and human character without ending. The revelation of Boo Radley's presence in the aftermath of the attack is a quiet upheaval, a moment that shifts the landscape of Scout and Jem's understanding in ways that are subtle, profound, and morally instructive. I remember as a child how the unknown often occupies the imagination, how fear and curiosity intertwine, and how discovery can dissolve illusions while revealing truths that were always present beneath the surface. For Scout and Jem, Boo Radley, once the subject of neighborhood gossip, childhood myths, and shadowy speculation, emerges as a tangible figure whose courage, empathy, and moral integrity challenge the prejudices they had absorbed unconsciously from society, from stories, and from their own early assumptions. The children's encounter with Boo is not theatrical but understated, revealing the essence of his character through action rather than words. I recall observing in my youth that the truest understanding of people often emerges not from what they proclaim, but from what they do, the quiet consistencies of behavior, and the ethical choices made when no audience is present. Boo's intervention in the attack is emblematic of such quiet heroism, a moral act performed without expectation of acknowledgement or reward. Scout and Jem perceive that his courage is not the flamboyant sort celebrated in storybooks, but a grounded, ethical bravery, the kind that risks personal harm to protect others, embodying the principles of integrity and empathy in a profoundly human way. The children are forced to confront their own biases and misconceptions. I remember the early realization in my life that fear of the unknown can warp judgment, that imagination fueled by rumor often obscures reality, and that human character cannot be fully understood without direct experience and empathetic reflection. Scout and Jem recognize that the stories they have constructed about Boo were a mixture of folklore, fear, and misunderstanding, and that these tales have unfairly shaped their perceptions. This moment of recognition is a moral lesson that prejudices, even those held innocently or unconsciously, can blind one to the humanity of others, and that genuine understanding requires attention, observation, and empathy. The children's reflections on Boo Radley's actions illuminate broader truths about society. I recall noticing as a child that individuals often embody principles and virtues in ways that challenge prevailing social narratives, that goodness may exist outside the conventional spotlight, and that societal judgment is frequently distorted by rumor and fear. Boo, long ostracized and misunderstood by the community, acts decisively to protect those in danger, demonstrating that moral courage is independent of reputation, that character is revealed in deeds rather than words, and that human worth cannot be measured by social perception alone. Scout and Jem internalize these lessons, recognizing that the moral landscape of Maycomb, with all its prejudice and bias, can obscure the presence of virtue, and that understanding human character demands both openness and reflection. The children's encounter with Boo also fosters empathy on a deeper level. I remember learning as a child that stepping into another person's circumstances, imagining their fears and desires, was essential to forming ethical judgment. That empathy transforms understanding from abstract principle into lived awareness. Scout, in particular, experiences a profound shift in perspective as she recognizes Boo's humanity, his vulnerability, and his consistent ethical choices despite isolation and misunderstanding. Jem, too, grapples with the realization that heroism and morality are not always public or acknowledged, and that individuals often act rightly in ways invisible to the majority. The encounter teaches that ethical discernment is inseparable from empathetic engagement, that seeing the world through another's eyes is a moral imperative, and that human goodness often manifests quietly, requiring perception and reflection to appreciate fully. Boo Radley's presence disrupts the conventional narratives of fear and courage that Scout and Jem have been constructing throughout their childhood. I recall noticing how, as children, we often simplify morality into categories of good and bad, brave and cowardly, familiar and frightening, without grasping the subtlety of human complexity. Boo's actions demonstrate that moral courage can coexist with social marginalization, that heroism may be silent and unacknowledged, and that fear of the unknown often obscures the ethical depth of others. Scout and Jem learn that judgment based on appearances or rumor is inadequate, and that authentic understanding emerges from experience, attention, and ethical reflection. The moment also underscores the theme of protection and ethical responsibility. I remember early observations of how individuals who recognize vulnerability in others often assume a quiet duty to act. That courage frequently entails safeguarding those who cannot protect themselves. Boo Radley's intervention exemplifies this principle, and Scout and Jem come to see that moral courage is relational as well as individual, concerned not solely with personal principle, but with the welfare of others. They recognize that heroism can be an unheralded act of protection, that ethical responsibility is inseparable from empathy, and that integrity is measured by deeds as much as by internal conviction. The encounter further challenges the children's understanding of justice and societal perception. I remember forming the first inklings as a child that social judgment is often flawed, that prejudice and fear can distort collective morality, and that true justice requires attention to truth and context. Scout and Jem see how Boo, though maligned and misunderstood, enacts justice in a personal and ethical way, intervening where the law, social expectation, or community judgment has failed. This understanding reinforces the idea that ethical action may transcend societal norms, that courage and goodness can be overlooked by the majority, and that moral discernment requires independent reflection, attention, and the willingness to recognize virtue where it is least expected. The encounter also evokes a profound recognition of human vulnerability and interconnectedness. I recall early experiences of realizing that people are bound together by acts of protection, empathy, and moral courage, that the well-being of one often depends on the attentiveness and ethical commitment of others. Scout and Jem perceive that Boo's actions, though discreet, embody this principle, demonstrating the quiet interdependence that sustains human communities. They begin to appreciate that courage is relational, that ethical choices impact others directly, and that understanding human character entails both observation of deeds and awareness of context, circumstance, and vulnerability. The children's perception of fear and morality is reshaped in this encounter. I remember as a child first recognizing that courage and fear coexist, that moral action is not the absence of vulnerability, but the willingness to act rightly despite it, and that ethical discernment often emerges under pressure. Scout and Jem internalize that confronting their own assumptions, responding to unexpected danger, and recognizing virtue in unfamiliar places are essential to ethical growth. They see that courage is multifaceted, encompassing both physical intervention and moral perception, and that heroism may exist quietly, unacknowledged, yet profoundly transformative. Finally, the revelation of Boo Radley crystallizes lessons about empathy, courage, and prejudice. I remember the moments in my own childhood when understanding others in their full complexity shifted my perception of the world, teaching me that human character is revealed through action, that ethical understanding requires attention and reflection, and that prejudice obscures truth. Scout and Jem integrate this understanding into their moral consciousness, recognizing that fear of the unknown, rumor, and social expectation can distort judgment, that courage and virtue often reside where least expected, and that ethical life requires both perception and empathy. The encounter with Boo Radley becomes a defining lesson in human morality, demonstrating that understanding, protection, and integrity are inseparable, and that true courage is as much about quiet, consistent action as it is about recognition, shaping the children's ethical awareness and their understanding of humanity without ending. As the seasons turn and the rhythms of Maycomb continue their familiar patterns, Scout and Jem carry with them the weight of experiences that have transformed their understanding of the world, of justice, and of human character. I remember in my own childhood the subtle but unshakable way in which certain events shape perception, instilling lessons not through lectures or admonitions, but through lived experience and careful observation. The trials of the past months, the confrontation with human prejudice, the encounter with courage in its many forms, and the revelation of Boo Radley as a protector and moral agent coalesce into a set of understandings that are both personal and universal. Lessons in empathy, justice, and the enduring complexity of humanity. Empathy emerges as perhaps the most persistent and transformative lesson. I recall the first stirrings of empathy in my own youth. Moments when observing the struggles, joys, or vulnerabilities of others left a lasting imprint on my understanding of human connection. Scout and Jem learned that empathy requires more than a casual awareness of others' feelings. It demands attention, imagination, and the willingness to see the world from another's perspective. They internalize Atticus's guidance that one cannot truly understand another person until stepping into their shoes, a principle that becomes tangible through interactions with figures like Boo Radley and Tom Robinson, through encounters with neighbors, and through observing the spectrum of human behavior that ranges from courage to cruelty, from compassion to malice. Empathy is revealed not merely as a passive sentiment, but as an active, guiding force that shapes perception, judgment, and action, transforming childhood observation into moral consciousness. The children's understanding of justice is inseparable from their experiences with prejudice, inequality, and moral courage. I remember as a child wrestling with the awareness that fairness is not automatically enforced, that societal structures often perpetuate injustice, and that the law, while a framework, is insufficient without ethical vigilance. Scout and Jem recognized that justice is not merely a legal principle, but a lived ethical imperative, one that requires courage, attention, and the persistent challenge of societal bias. Tom Robinson's trial crystallizes this lesson in stark terms, revealing the chasm between legal procedure and moral right, and teaching the children that advocating for justice is both necessary and demanding, that moral clarity does not guarantee protection or reward, and that human beings are called to act ethically, even when the world conspires against fairness. The revelation of Boo Radley further deepens their understanding of humanity, demonstrating that virtue often exists outside public acknowledgement, that courage may be quiet, and that moral action is not measured by applause or recognition, but by the impact it has on those in need. I remember early experiences of recognizing that some of the most meaningful acts of kindness, protection, or ethical courage are unheralded, and that moral life often operates in the shadows of social awareness. Scout and Jem come to appreciate the quiet heroism in everyday moral choices, learning that integrity, empathy, and responsibility are intertwined, and that recognizing virtue in unexpected places is essential to a nuanced understanding of human character. The intersection of fear and courage provides another enduring lesson. I recall the first instances in childhood when confronting uncertainty or danger revealed the measure of character, when the ability to act rightly in the face of fear became a formative experience. Scout and Jem experience fear both physically and emotionally. During the attack by Bob Ewell, in confronting societal prejudice, and in navigating the unknown aspects of human character, and learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the capacity to act rightly despite it. This understanding transforms their conception of bravery from the romanticized notions of childhood into an ethical, relational principle, where courage is expressed in protection, in moral consistency, and in the willingness to act for the welfare of others, often without expectation of reward. The moral and social complexity of Maycomb itself becomes a central teacher. I remember noticing in my youth how communities are layered with subtle codes, unspoken expectations, and moral contradictions, and how understanding human behavior requires both observation and reflection. Scout and Jem learn to navigate these complexities, witnessing the interplay of prejudice, compassion, cowardice, and courage among neighbors, friends, and adversaries. They perceive that human behavior is rarely simple, that ethical life demands discernment, and that moral action must be measured against both principle and circumstance. The town itself, with its contradictions, becomes a living classroom, demonstrating that the pursuit of justice, empathy, and understanding is a continual endeavor, one that requires both attentiveness and ethical resilience. The children's growth is also reflected in their self-understanding, in their recognition of the responsibilities and capacities inherent in moral consciousness. I remember early experiences of realizing that understanding the world is inseparable from understanding oneself, that ethical development is both internal and relational. Scout and Jem begin to grasp that their observations, choices, and responses carry consequences, that the cultivation of empathy and moral discernment shapes their own character as much as it shapes their understanding of others. They learn that growing up involves both awareness of the flaws and virtues in the world and a commitment to act ethically within it, integrating lessons of justice, courage, and empathy into a developing sense of personal responsibility. The events surrounding the trial, the attack, and Boo Radley's revelation collectively underscore the interdependence of moral principles. I recall formative experiences in my youth where observing connections between justice, empathy, and courage revealed patterns of ethical coherence that were not immediately obvious. Scout and Jem recognize that ethical life is not compartmentalized. Understanding, moral action, and emotional engagement are inseparable. To act justly requires empathy, to act courageously requires moral clarity, and to perceive humanity in its complexity requires both attentiveness and ethical imagination. These lessons are integrated into the children's consciousness, providing a framework for navigating the moral ambiguities and social challenges that will continue to shape their lives. The children also confront the reality of human imperfection, learning to recognize both the capacity for cruelty and the potential for virtue within the same individuals. I remember realizing as a child that human beings are rarely wholly good or evil, that understanding character demands observation, reflection, and ethical judgment. Scout and Jem perceive the coexistence of courage and prejudice, kindness and malice, weakness and principle, and learn that moral discernment requires attention to nuance, the willingness to withhold simplistic judgment, and the cultivation of compassion even toward those who fail ethically. This awareness is a profound step in their maturation, transforming moral education from abstract principle into a lived, nuanced comprehension of humanity. Finally, the lessons of empathy, justice, and humanity are inseparable from the ongoing presence of Atticus as both moral guide and living example. I recall how adults in my childhood communicated ethical truths not merely through words, but through steadfast action, shaping understanding through example, consistency, and moral courage. Scout and Jem internalize these principles through observation and reflection, recognizing that ethical guidance is most effective when embodied, that moral life is as much about daily choices as dramatic acts, and that integrity, courage, and compassion require sustained attention and commitment. Atticus's example demonstrates that ethical development is a lifelong pursuit, that understanding humanity requires both observation and participation, and that the cultivation of empathy, justice, and moral awareness is an ongoing process that shapes not only character, but community, sustaining the delicate balance between human potential for good and the ever-present risk of harm. In the end, the experiences of Scout and Jem, the lessons embedded in the trial, the attack, and the revelation of Boo Radley converge into a comprehensive understanding of human nature. I remember as a child sensing that these realizations would inform not only ethical reasoning but also emotional resilience, social perception, and the capacity for compassionate action. They learn that empathy is both a guiding principle and a practical tool, that justice is an ongoing pursuit demanding courage and vigilance, and that humanity is neither simple nor uniform but complex, layered, and capable of both cruelty and profound goodness. The culmination of these lessons leaves the children with a moral awareness that is expansive yet intimate, challenging yet sustaining, a framework for interpreting the world and their place in it, a consciousness shaped by experience, reflection, and the enduring influence of those who act rightly and courageously among them.